There are some stories that don't just ask, what if you could go back, but instead whisper something more unsettling, what if you came back, and the person you loved the most had no idea who you really were. Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah, the 2026 romantic reincarnation melodrama out of China, doesn't kick down the door with big-budget action or high-concept sci-fi. It slips quietly into the room and sits across from you, like an old friend with a painful memory to share, and before you know it, you're pulled into this intricate dance of regret, revenge, and the fragile hope that maybe this time, in this life, we don't have to make the same mistakes again. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah is one of those titles that, on paper, sounds like a familiar melodramatic setup. A powerful heir, Su Linfeng, destroyed in his past life by the wife who used him, dies with a broken heart and a shattered legacy, and is suddenly given another chance, reborn with the memories of that ruin still smoldering in his chest. But instead of simply swearing vengeance on the entire world, he does something more interesting, more vulnerable. He chooses differently. He refuses to retrace the same path that led him to hell, and instead turns toward the quiet, pure presence of Lincier, a woman who, in this life, barely seems to recognize the gravity of what they once meant to each other, yet whose existence carries this soft echo of childhood, of a summer long forgotten, of small kindnesses that once held his lonely world together. The film takes that premise and spins it out into a layered exploration of what it means to truly change, not just circumstances, but the soul that moves through those circumstances. And what makes it work isn't just the plot mechanics of reincarnation, but the way the film lingers on silences, on glances, on those tiny everyday decisions that, in the grand cosmic scheme of things, decide who we become when life gives us a second shot. From the outset, the movie situates itself in that familiar world of modern Chinese urban drama, towering glass offices, smoky boardrooms, rain-soaked streets lit up by neon, and behind it all this lineage of power and expectation pressing down on Su Linfeng's shoulders like an invisible weight carried over from one lifetime to the next. There's a tactile, grounded sense to the corporate backdrop, but what the film is really interested in is the emotional finance inside his heart, the debts he thinks he has to repay, the bankruptcies of trust, the cautious investments of belief that he starts making in people he once overlooked. And because Su Linfeng remembers, because he's living this life with the hindsight of a man who's already watched his world collapse once before, every decision he makes has this ghostly double exposure. You can almost see the version of him from the previous life making the wrong choice, walking into the trap, smiling into the betrayal, while the current him quietly steps aside from that fate and says, "Not this time." The story kicks off with that sense of déjà vu. It opens on a night that feels like a reflection of the night he died in his past life. There's a storm, there's a board meeting, there's that same feeling of cold-blooded eyes watching him, but instead of collapsing, instead of handing over power to a wife who whispers comfort while hiding knives behind her back, he plays it differently. He doesn't sign the paper, he doesn't trust the sweet words, and it's such a small moment of divergence that the film almost underplays it. There's no triumphant music, no melodramatic thunderclap. Just a quiet, steadying breath, a pen placed back on the table. And that's what sets the tone. This isn't a revenge fantasy, it's a redemption drama about micro-choices. The ex-wife from his previous life does appear, as a kind of spectral presence in his mind, but in this life, she's not yet his wife. She's a cold opportunity, a temptation, the kind of person that his family, hungry for alliances and blind to emotional nuance, would push him toward again. And there's a chilling calm in the way he quietly, politely, refuses. He still shows her respect on the surface, but in his eyes, you can see the grave of a love that already died once. He's not bitter in the loud, vengeful way, he's bitter in that restrained, exhausted way of a man who doesn't have the energy to hate someone twice. That's a choice the film makes that really works. Instead of making Su Linfeng this wild, vindictive reincarnated hero, it makes him tired, introspective, and strangely gentle. He's wealthy and powerful, yes, but his power feels like a burden he's constantly asking himself whether he truly wants to carry into this new life. Then there's Lincier. The film doesn't introduce her with some overdramatic slow-motion entrance. We meet her in a crowded city street, slightly late for a shift at a small dessert shop, fumbling with a bag of groceries, almost getting hit by a car because she's too caught up in her thoughts. She's ordinary on the surface, but the camera lingers on the quiet details, the way she stops to help an old lady who drops a bag of vegetables, the way she apologizes too easily, the way she laughs to herself when she realizes she's smeared flour on her cheek without noticing. There's something unpolished, honest, and vulnerable about her. She's not written as the flawless, holy white lotus type you see in some dramas. She gets angry, she gets insecure, she makes mistakes. But where the ex-wife archetype in his past life was sharp, calculating, always one step ahead in the game of manipulation, Lincier moves through life in this slightly offbeat, sincere rhythm, almost unaware of how harsh the world can really be. The twist is that, as the story gently reveals, she isn't just a new love interest placed into his new life as a clean slate. She's someone from before, from his childhood, from that time before money, power, betrayal, when Su Linfeng was just a lonely boy in a big cold house, and she was this small, bright presence who used to share her snacks with him over the wall, who once ran with him under the rain and promised that no matter how big they grew, they wouldn't forget that day. Of course, in the rush of his first life, he did forget. He buried those memories under ambition, under family expectation, under the dazzling glare of a marriage that looked perfect on paper but was rotten underneath. And there's something aching about watching him see Lincier again in this life, recognizing her instantly, feeling that old warmth flare up in his chest, while she just looks at him and sees a stranger, a rich customer, a slightly intimidating man in a tailored suit who seems oddly fascinated by the girl who gets frosting on her hands and laughs too loud. That imbalance of recognition is where so much of the emotion in this film lives. We as the audience are aligned with Su Linfeng's perspective, knowing the weight that hangs between them, while she, innocent of all this cosmic backstory, just tries to go about her day. Every time he looks at her, you can feel 1,000 unsaid apologies sitting on his tongue, apologies for forgetting her in that first life, for walking into the wrong marriage, for letting himself be destroyed so thoroughly that whatever thread connected them got severed for years. And that's something the film explores beautifully through small, intimate scenes. The first real turning point between them isn't some dramatic rescue or a grand romantic gesture, it's when he returns to the dessert shop several times, not really saying anything, just sitting in the corner, watching her work. She's weirded out at first, who wouldn't be? This insanely well-dressed, clearly wealthy man just comes in, orders the same simple cake, and stares at the raindrops on the window while she wipes tables and jokes with co-workers. Eventually, she walks over, slightly defensive, and asks him flat out why he keeps coming back. It's such a simple question, but you can see he's not ready to tell her the truth, that he's trying to re-anchor himself in this life, that her presence feels like a lighthouse through all the fog of revenge and regret inside him. So he gives a half-truth, he says the cakes remind him of something he liked as a child. That's when she smiles in this puzzled, distant way and mentions that she used to share cakes with a boy over a garden wall when she was little, that she's always hoped he grew up well. She says it like a passing anecdote, but for him, it's like someone just reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart. The film nails that moment, holding just a bit too long on his eyes as they flicker with recognition and this quiet, almost terrified joy. He wants to say, "It was me, it's always been me," but he doesn't. Not yet. Instead, he takes that small story and places it next to his memories of their childhood, and you can feel the film tightening that emotional knot that's going to unravel later. From there, the narrative gradually starts weaving together his two main threads, his determination not to repeat the mistakes of his previous life, and his growing conviction that choosing Lincier is his way of rewriting his fate. The rejecting his past part isn't just about avoiding the ex-wife, it's also about how he handles his family's business, how he interacts with the board members who betrayed him in his past life, how he reacts to the same crises that once brought him down. In his previous life, he was arrogant, trusting the wrong people, turning a blind eye to corruption because it served his short-term interest, constantly trying to prove himself as a worthy heir. In this life, those same situations reappear, and the film smartly echoes lines of dialogue or framing to drive home the parallel. But now he's a man who's already paid the full price of those errors. There's a scene early on where his uncle suggests a shady financial maneuver that in the past life led to a scandal that almost tanked the company, and you see this flash of memory play across Su Linfeng's face, reporters shouting, shareholders yelling, the ex-wife standing slightly behind him, whispering, "Don't worry, I'll stand by you," as she quietly arranged his downfall. In this life, he hears the same suggestion, pauses, and says, "No." We're not going to do that. If we're going to build something that lasts, we have to clean the rot out whether it hurts or not. It's a small boardroom scene, but emotionally, it's a defiant middle finger to the ghost of his past self. Of course, choosing another path doesn't magically free him from the consequences. The people who benefited from his previous weakness are not thrilled to discover he's playing a new game now. There's tension in the company, subtle sabotage, people watching him more carefully, wondering where this newfound clarity and steel is coming from. And the film sets up this quiet ticking clock. Will his attempt to rewrite his life in the corporate world collide fatally with his attempt to protect and cherish Lincier in his personal life? The answer, predictably but powerfully, is yes. This is a melodrama, after all, and the film is not afraid to break its characters to see what they are really made of. What's interesting is the way Su Lin Feng navigates his feelings for Lincier. He doesn't immediately confess, "I loved you in another life," which would be both insane and unfair. Instead, he starts approaching her the way he wishes he had approached relationships in his previous life, slowly, respectfully, without using his wealth as a weapon. He offers small kindnesses, he invests anonymously in the tiny dessert shop where she works when it's at risk of shutting down, he arranges under the table for the landlord not to raise their rent even though the whole street is being redeveloped, he shows up on the worst rainy days to make sure she has a taxi home. But every time she thanks him, he downplays it, almost embarrassed, like he doesn't feel he has the right to be seen as a good man yet, not until he's paid off the karmic debt of the first life. And Lincier, being who she is, doesn't fall for him just because he's rich or kind. If anything, his kindness makes her suspicious at first, because in her world, rich men who suddenly take an interest in poor girls aren't exactly known for pure intentions. There's a superb argument scene where she finally calls him out on this. She confronts him in the rain outside the shop, asking him why he's interfering with her life, accusing him of making her dependent on his generosity, of treating her like a charity case. She insists that her dignity doesn't have a price, and that if he thinks he can buy his way into her world by playing silent guardian, he's completely misunderstood her. It's raw, it's uncomfortable, and it's one of the best scenes in the film because it holds him accountable in a way his past life never did. In that moment, he could easily fall back into that old air persona, cold, defensive, arrogant. Instead, he stands there, getting drenched, visibly shaken, and admits, voice barely above a whisper, that he doesn't know how to do this right, that he's trying to make up for things she doesn't even remember, that he knows he's crossing lines but doesn't know how to stop because watching her struggle feels like being forced to watch a fire he once started spread all over again. He doesn't give specifics, of course, but there's such raw ache in his honesty that it disarms her anger just a bit. She tells him, trembling, that if he really wants to know her, he has to start by treating her as his equal, not as some fragile relic from a guilt-ridden dream. And that, in a way, becomes the film's emotional thesis. If you're given a second chance, you can't just protect people from above, you have to stand beside them, even if that means risking their anger, their misunderstanding, and their eventual rejection. Cinematically, the movie leans into these kinds of confrontations with a style that feels almost theatrical at times, but never cheap. There's a deliberate use of reflected surfaces, mirrors, glass windows, puddles, polished office tables. Characters are often framed in ways that show two versions of them at once, echoing the reincarnation theme without hammering it on the nose. Su Lin Feng's face, half in shadow, half caught in the golden light of some late afternoon sun, becomes a visual metaphor we see again and again, a man split between who he was and who he's trying to become. Lincier, on the other hand, is often shot in softer, warmer tones, surrounded by textures of wood, fabric, flower dust, rain-soaked streets that feel lived in. When their worlds intersect, the film visually blends their palettes, letting the cold blues and greys of his corporate life bleed into the amber glow of her small, domestic spaces. It's subtle but effective, giving their interactions this distinct visual identity that signals not just romance, but a merging of two utterly different incarnations of reality. One of the smartest choices the film makes is in how it reveals the full story of Su Lin Feng's past life. It doesn't dump it all on us in a massive exposition flashback at the beginning. Instead, it drip-feeds us key moments from that first life through sensory triggers. A certain cologne smell that reminds him of the night of betrayal. The clink of a wine glass that suddenly transports him back to the anniversary dinner where his ex-wife smiled across the table and congratulated him on a promotion she herself had sabotaged. The sound of a lullaby on a music box that pulls up the image of a small girl he almost had, a daughter whose existence was snuffed out by a choice that the film only alludes to until much later. These fragmented glimpses not only keep us hooked, piecing together what happened, but they also mirror the way trauma resurfaces in real life, not as neatly packaged narratives, but as sharp, intrusive flashes that interrupt the present. And through those glimpses, we come to understand just how deeply Su Linfeng's trust was violated, and just how thoroughly he was complicit in his own downfall. The ex-wife, in that previous life, wasn't some cartoonish villain. She's portrayed as ambitious, cold, and calculating, yes, but the film lets us see the ways he ignored the warning signs, the red flags he rationalized away because he was so desperate to be loved, to show the world he had it all. He overlooked how she talked about people as tools, how she belittled those below her station, how she always framed their shared future in terms of what they could acquire rather than who they could become. In revisiting those moments, the film isn't just saying, look, she was evil. It's saying, look, he chose this. He let himself be dazzled. His rebirth doesn't absolve him of that, it just gives him a chance to finally admit it. That's one of the more mature aspects of the storytelling. Reincarnation isn't treated as some magic eraser, but as a brutally honest mirror held up to his own character. The performances carry a lot of this weight. The actor playing Su Linfeng, and keep in mind, by 2026 standards, Chinese cinema has really honed this archetype, gives us a layered portrayal of a man in his second run at life, balancing the gravitas of someone who's already seen the end credits with the vulnerability of someone who's actually more afraid this time around. He doesn't overdo the stoic CEO thing, instead, there's this slight stiffness in his posture whenever he's around his family, this tiny hesitation before he speaks in board meetings, as if he's constantly measuring his words against the memory of having them twisted against him before. Then, around Lincier, you see him soften in the most vulnerable ways, his shoulders drop, his voice lowers, he smiles more easily, but there's always a trace of sadness in those smiles, like he's aware that every happy moment is borrowed time he maybe doesn't deserve. As for Lincier, the actress nails that tricky combination of kindness and backbone. She's not a passive angel floating through the story, she snaps back when she feels patronized, she gets jealous, she makes rash decisions out of insecurity. She has her own backstory of abandonment and struggle, growing up with a single mother who worked herself half to death to keep a tiny stall running in a market that was constantly being pushed out by big development projects like the one Su Linfeng's family company bankrolls. So there's a bitter irony when she starts to fall for a man who represents, in many ways, the very forces that made her childhood so unstable. The film doesn't shy away from this. There's a sequence where a protest breaks out against a new commercial redevelopment, and Lincier finds out her little dessert shop's building is slated for demolition. She joins the crowd, chanting, holding signs, only to see Su Linfeng arriving in a black car, stepping out in a crisp suit, surrounded by security. In her eyes, he is suddenly the enemy. And you get that classic drama moment where their gazes lock across the distance, her eyes full of betrayal, his full of regret and helplessness. He knew this project was on the slate because he remembers it from his past life, but he had tried to steer it differently this time. He had quietly fought to save certain areas, had moved numbers around to try to spare the block where the dessert shop stands. But in a company that large, with that many wolves in suits eyeing his position, there's only so much he can do without exposing his own hand too early. The film uses this arc to explore the theme of systemic guilt versus personal guilt. How much is Su Linfeng responsible for a machine that was built before he was born, that's too big for one man to turn overnight? How much is his second chance about changing the world, versus just changing how he moves through it? These questions simmer under the surface, and while the film doesn't provide simple answers, it does force him to confront them. Their conflict here is particularly poignant because it's not about cheating or some soap opera misunderstanding, it's about worldview, about the hard reality that love doesn't erase structural injustice. Lincier's eventual willingness to listen to him, to understand the constraints he's under, doesn't come easy. She feels like she's betraying her past, her mother's sacrifices, by even giving him a chance to explain. And when he finally does, the way he talks is telling. He doesn't justify his family's actions, doesn't say, this is just how the world works. Instead, he admits that he was a coward in his past life, that he benefited from silence, and that in this life, he's trying to be braver, but he's still learning how to fight with the right weapons. You get these scenes of him clumsily trying to push corporate policies that prioritize relocation support, small business partnerships, long-term community benefits, and you can almost hear the board members' eyes rolling. It's idealistic, they say, it's naive. But the film uses that idealism to set up its emotional stakes. Being reborn doesn't make you omnipotent, it just makes you painfully, acutely aware of every compromise. On the pacing front, Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah is unhurried, and that will be a dividing line for a lot of viewers. It's not a fast, twisty thriller, it's a slow-burn character piece that takes its time letting you live with these people. There are multiple scenes where nothing happens, in the traditional sense. Su Linfeng sitting in his car outside the dessert shop, listening to an old children's song, Lincier lying in bed at night, staring at a crack in the ceiling, wondering why her heart aches when she thinks about him. If you're looking for rapid-fire plot, this might test your patience. But if you're the kind of viewer who likes to settle into a story, to feel it breathe, you'll probably appreciate how the film lets its emotions simmer rather than boil over constantly. The music supports this mood beautifully, leaning into piano-driven themes, light strings, and occasional traditional instruments that surface in childhood flashbacks. Each character seems to have a motif. Su Linfeng's is restrained, almost minimalistic, while Lincier's is more melodic and hopeful. When their themes intertwine in key scenes, you feel it. One standout moment is a mid-film sequence where they revisit the old neighborhood where they once played as children. It's changed, of course, gentrified, polished, sanitized, but there's one corner, one small, slightly run-down house with a half-broken garden wall that's still there. He doesn't tell her outright that it's the wall they once shared, he just suggests they walk that way, his heart pounding in his ears. When they reach it, you see something flicker in her eyes, like a distant echo, a ghost of a memory she can't quite catch. She reaches out, runs her fingers along the cracked bricks, and says, quietly, "When I was little, there was a boy. I used to pass snacks over a wall like this." Her voice trails off. She can't recall his face, but the feeling, that soft warmth of being seen and shared with, lingers. Su Linfeng stands beside her, breath catching, and in that moment, he doesn't claim it, doesn't say, "It was me." Instead, he says, he must have cherished those days. It's such a gentle, heartbreaking choice, because it reflects how deeply he's changed. In his previous life, he might have rushed to stake a claim, to turn this into a romantic revelation. In this one, he's more focused on honoring her feelings than on satisfying his own desire to be recognized. Of course, at some point, the truth of their shared past has to surface, and when it does, the film doesn't stage it as a neatly packaged, tearful confession in the rain. Instead, it comes out almost by accident, through a third party. There's an old housekeeper from his childhood estate, a woman who remembers both of them, who once used to sneak Lincier into the garden when Su Linfeng's strict family forbade him from playing with children from lower stations. In this life, she stumbles upon them together in a chance encounter, recognizes Lincier's features instantly, and in her joy, bursts out with the truth, "Young master, it's the little girl from the wall." Lincier turns, stunned, and slowly, the pieces start sliding into place. The yellow umbrella in her half-remembered dream. The taste of almond cakes in summer. The boy who cried once, when she scraped her knee, as if her pain hurt him more than his own beatings ever did. It's like watching a dam break behind her eyes. The film shoots this scene without dramatic score at first, just the sound of the city muffled in the background, as her breathing grows shallow and she stares at Su Linfeng like she is seeing him for the first time. Then, quietly, the music swells. She asks him, voice trembling, "Why didn't you tell me?" And his answer is simple, hoarse, "Because the boy you remember was better than the man I became. I didn't want to stain that memory." This line is one of the emotional peaks of the movie, encapsulating the shame and unworthiness he's been carrying from one life to the next. It's not that he doubted she would accept him, it's that he didn't feel he deserved to reclaim that pure part of his past after living so long in a corrupted version of himself. Her reaction is complicated, and that's where the film's emotional honesty shines. She doesn't melt into his arms immediately. Instead, she steps back, grappling with the sense of being robbed of years of knowing him, of all the times they might have crossed paths earlier if he had just said something. She feels this weird betrayal, like he's been playing with a loaded deck in their growing relationship, holding cards to his chest while she laid herself bare. She tells him she needs time, that she has to grieve the lost years, the missed chances, the way fate was so cruel as to separate two children who had promised never to forget each other. The film gives her that space, and it's important, because too often, reincarnation stories focus so heavily on the hero's guilt and growth that the heroine becomes little more than a forgiving reward. Here, Lincier's hurt is treated as real, valid, and not something that can be brushed aside with a grand declaration. As the plot thickens in the second half, external pressures intensify. The power struggle inside Su Linfeng's family company comes to a head. The ex-wife from his past life, now a rising star in a rival firm, is circling him like a shark, sensing that he's different this time, but not knowing why. Her role in this life isn't to seduce him into marriage again, but to lure him into a business merger that would effectively hand over control of his company's most valuable projects. She represents the seductive pull of his old patterns, the temptation to prioritize short-term gains, flashy alliances, and the illusion of stability over the messy, uncertain, but honest path of doing what's right. There's a chilling scene where she invites him to dinner, in a restaurant that mirrors one of their anniversary spots from the previous life. The film cross-cuts between that past sequence and the present one, showing us the almost identical setup, the candlelight, the wine, the way she leans in with that same conspiratorial smile. But whereas in the past, his eyes were full of boyish adoration, in the present, they're guarded, distant. She makes her pitch, laying out the numbers. The potential profits, the mutual benefits. It's all so rational, so seductive. And then she plays her trump card. She suggests that, beyond business, they make their partnership more personal, hinting at rekindling something that, in this life, never even officially began. It's her way of testing whether she still has the same power over him, whether the version of Su Linfeng she once destroyed is still in there somewhere, waiting to be manipulated. His response is one of the film's most quietly triumphant moments. He doesn't explode, doesn't lecture her about morals or loyalty. He just looks at her for a long time and says, with this weird mix of sadness and finality, that he's no longer interested in alliances built on pretense. He thanks her for the offer, acknowledges that in another life he probably would have leapt at the chance, and then, with a small, almost apologetic smile, refuses. It's a refusal not just of her, but of the entire self he used to be under her influence. If you've ever watched someone finally step away from a toxic relationship, you'll recognize the power in that simple, calm, no, of course, she doesn't take rejection well. Her wounded pride turns into spite, and she starts using every tool at her disposal to undermine him, leaking documents, stirring up old scandals, weaponizing the media's fascination with the cold air and the nobody girl he's rumored to be protecting. The press gets wind of his connection to Lincier, painting her as a gold digger, questioning her intentions, dragging her family history into public spectacle. Where it could have gone wrong would be if the film turned this into a martyr narrative, making her suffer in silence while he broods in a corner. Instead, it lets her rage. There's a scene where she storms into his office, throws a tabloid on his desk, and demands to know why loving someone like him has to mean setting herself on fire in public. She accuses him of underestimating the cost she's paying just by being near him. And, crucially, he doesn't dismiss her pain. He doesn't tell her to be strong, or that this is the price of love. He admits that he dragged her into his unfinished war from a past life she never consented to, that his obsession with rewriting his fate made him blind to the fact that, in doing so, he might be writing her into a tragedy she didn't choose. That admission is part of his growth, understanding that second chances, even when well-intentioned, can become selfish if you treat other people as instruments in your redemption arc. This is where the film's thematic core really crystallizes. Rebirth is not about controlling the outcome this time, it's about finally accepting that you cannot shield the people you love from all harm, and that the most loving thing you can do might sometimes be to let go. And yes, the film does flirt with that possibility, that Su Linfeng might have to walk away from Lincier to truly free her from the karma of his previous life. But the way it navigates that is more nuanced than a simple noble idiot sacrifice, because it acknowledges that leaving someone, for their own good, can be just as controlling as clinging to them. The question becomes, can they face the storm together as equals, or will his guilt and her fear tear them apart? Stylistically, the climax is staged not with a massive accident or a shocking death, but with a convergence of emotional and professional crises. A critical vote at the company, stirred up by the ex-wife's manipulations and the internal enemies who preferred the old, malleable Su Linfeng, threatens to oust him from power completely. At the same time, Lincier's dessert shop faces its final notice. Despite his earlier efforts, the redevelopment forces are moving in. The old neighborhood where they once shared those childhood memories is on the brink of being wiped clean, literally erased from the map like the past he's been trying to outrun. In the lead-up to this, we get one of the most beautiful sequences in the film, Lincier, sitting alone in the shop on its last night, baking one final batch of the almond cakes she used to share as a child, surrounded by the fading warmth of a place that held so much of her. She's made a decision. We don't know exactly what it is yet, but we can feel its weight. Meanwhile, Su Linfeng is in the boardroom, facing down a room full of men who consider him either a liability or a threat. He has a choice: to fight dirty, to unleash some of the backup plans he's quietly prepared, blackmail, power plays, legal loopholes, or to accept that maybe he's not meant to be the one steering this ship, that his second chance isn't about reclaiming the same throne, but about stepping away from it. The film cross-cuts between these two spaces, her small, warm, dimly lit shop, and his cold, vast, brightly illuminated boardroom. The contrast is striking. As they both move toward their respective decisions, you realize that the true climax isn't whether he keeps the company, or whether the shop survives. It's whether they can both choose a path that's authentic to who they've become in this life, rather than who they were before. When the dust settles, the movie makes a bold choice. It has Su Linfeng voluntarily walk away from the company, not out of defeat, but out of principle. He refuses to sign a compromise deal that would save his position at the cost of sacrificing the very ethics he's spent this life trying to build. He basically tells them that if the price of leading is becoming the kind of man he was before, then they can have the title. He'd rather walk out with clean hands than stay in power with dirty ones. It's not a crowd-pleasing mic drop moment with applause and cheers. It's quieter, more uncertain. As he leaves the boardroom, his future is a blank page. Will he regret this? Will he struggle? Probably. But that's the point. Second chances are scary precisely because they require you to step into the unknown, rather than reasserting control over familiar structures. Parallel to that, we find out what Lincier has decided. She hasn't run away. She hasn't broken up with him to set him free, in that overused trope way. Instead, she's found a third path. She's negotiated, with help from a small coalition of local businesses and a few surprisingly sympathetic city officials, to relocate her shop into a new community space that will be co-owned by the neighborhood residents. It's not the same old place. It doesn't have the cracked wall, the fading paint, the childhood echoes in the floorboards. But it's a space they can shape into something new, something that honors the past but isn't trapped by it. When Su Linfeng, carrying the weight of his resignation, arrives to find her packing boxes, he expects a goodbye. He thinks she's chosen a life away from him, one unshadowed by his complicated legacy. But instead, she places a small box in his hands. Inside, a single almond cake. Slightly imperfect, a little lopsided, just like the ones she used to make as a child. She tells him that she's scared, that starting over terrifies her, but that for the first time, she feels like she's not just reacting to life, but actively choosing it. Then she looks him in the eye and says that if he wants, he can choose it with her, not as the heir trying to fix his karma, not as the boy from the past demanding recognition, but as the man standing in front of her now, stripped of title, stripped of power, but full of honest intent. There's no sweeping kiss, no violins drowning out the sound of their breath. He just smiles through tears he doesn't bother to hide and says, "This time, I'd like to learn how to walk beside you, not ahead of you or behind you." And in that single line, you feel the full weight of his journey. For audience reaction, Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah hits that sweet spot for viewers who crave emotional catharsis and character-driven storytelling. It doesn't have the massive mainstream buzz of a blockbuster, but in circles that appreciate reincarnation dramas and redemption arcs, it's the kind of film that gets discussed for the nuances of its choices. People talk about how Su Linfeng is a rare example of a male lead who truly changes, not just in superficial behavior but in underlying worldview. They talk about how Lincier is allowed to be more than a symbol of purity, how her anger, doubt, and agency make her feel like a real person, not an idealized fantasy meant to heal a man's wounds. Critics have pointed out the film's willingness to sit in uncomfortable truths, that love doesn't erase class disparity, that good intentions don't automatically clean up systemic harm, that a second chance doesn't guarantee a better outcome unless you're willing to lose things you once thought defined you. Culturally, coming out in 2026, it lands in a landscape where more and more stories are asking how we reckon with past mistakes, both individually and collectively. In a world grappling with the consequences of unchecked growth, generational trauma, and the pressure to be constantly successful, the idea of a protagonist who willingly walks away from inherited power in favor of a quieter, more ethically coherent life hits home for a lot of people. There's a resonance in watching someone with every advantage realize that the real victory isn't in dominating the boardroom, but in learning how not to repeat harm, how to love without control, how to let go of the fantasy that we can ever fully fix the past. On a thematic level, the movie circles three big ideas: accountability across lifetimes, the difference between protection and partnership, and the courage to accept imperfect futures. Accountability across lifetimes shows up in how Su Linfeng doesn't treat reincarnation as a get-out-of-jail-free card. He constantly grapples with the knowledge that he was complicit in his downfall, that he enabled a harmful system, that he hurt not just himself but others by blindly chasing success. His second life doesn't exist to punish him. This isn't some karmic horror story, but it does insist that he face those truths head-on. The difference between protection and partnership plays out in his relationship with Lincier. His initial instinct to shield her from everything, to pull strings behind the scenes and fight her battles for her, is understandable, but ultimately patronizing. It's only when he starts truly listening to her, respecting her autonomy, and being honest about his own limits that their connection deepens into something reciprocal. And the courage to accept imperfect futures is the film's final gift to us. It reminds us that entering a second chance with the expectation of perfect outcomes is just another form of control. True change lies in embracing uncertainty, in being willing to lose what once made you feel safe, in trusting that a life built on honesty, even if smaller and less glamorous, is richer than one built on power and pretense. In terms of flaws, the film isn't perfect. Some viewers might find the pacing too slow, especially in the first act where Su Linfeng spends a lot of time just observing. A few side characters, especially among the corporate antagonists, veer into stereotype at times, more plot devices than fully fleshed out people. And there are moments when the reincarnation mechanics feel a bit underexplored. We don't get a metaphysical explanation of how or why he came back, which will either feel refreshingly restrained or frustratingly vague, depending on your taste. But if you're willing to accept that this is less about cosmic rules and more about inner rebirth, those gaps don't really hurt the experience. Ultimately, Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah stands out because it takes a premise we've seen many times: the wronged heir, the rebirth, the new love, and refuses to play it purely for revenge fantasy or wish fulfillment. Instead, it leans into the quiet, difficult work of change. It asks whether, if handed the script of your own life a second time, you would truly make different choices, or just rearrange the same pieces to get a slightly less painful version of the same story. It suggests that the bravest thing you can do with a second chance isn't to correct every wrong, but to finally tell the truth, to yourself, to the people you hurt, to the ones you love, and to the parts of your soul you buried to survive. When the credits roll, what stays with you isn't a big twist or a shocking reveal, but a series of small, human images: a boy and a girl sharing cakes over a wall, a man refusing to sign a paper that would seal his moral compromise, a woman choosing to rebuild her life in a new space rather than clinging to a ruined one, two people standing side by side, not with all their childhood memories fully restored, but with enough shared understanding to build something real in the present. It's in those images that the film earns its title: no longer the wronged lady, no longer the misguided heir, no longer the people they were when they let life happen to them. They are, instead, flawed, frightened, and finally free enough to stop being victims of their past and start being co-authors of their future. And as you sit there, maybe thinking about choices you wish you could redo, relationships you mishandled, paths you walked down because you were too scared to change direction, this film quietly, almost tenderly, asks you, if you got to live it all again, not in some fantasy afterlife, but starting tomorrow, what would you do differently? not to look like a better person, but to actually be one. Some stories ask you to believe in destiny, some stories ask you to believe in revenge, and then there are stories like Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah, a 2026 release that walks in carrying both of those ideas and then quietly stabs you with something even sharper, which is regret, because this is not just a romance about choosing the right woman, and it is not just a rebirth fantasy about correcting the past. It is a story about a man who has already lived through the consequences of loving the wrong person, already watched his name, his trust, his future, and his emotional core get ground down by a marriage built on manipulation, and when the impossible happens and life gives him another chance, the question is no longer whether he can win, but whether he can unlearn the damage that losing did to him in the first place. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Because this one is exactly the kind of series that people discover late at night, tell themselves they will only watch one episode, and then suddenly realize the sun is coming up and they are emotionally invested in every glance, every hesitation, every almost confession, every tiny shift in expression on a face that is trying so hard not to betray how badly it remembers being broken. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah arrives in 2026 with a premise that, on paper, sounds familiar if you know the modern wave of rebirth romance dramas, especially the ones built around powerful heirs, mistaken affections, revenge against betrayal, and the fantasy of returning to a crossroads with full knowledge of where the wrong road leads. But what makes this title feel more potent than a disposable genre exercise is how fully it commits to the emotional consequences of memory. It understands that second chances are not clean. They are not elegant. They are not these pretty wish fulfillment ribbons tied around fate. They are messy, haunted, and psychologically cruel. Because if you remember every lie, every humiliation, every moment when you ignored the person who would have truly loved you and instead devoted yourself to someone who was using you, then being reborn is not just a blessing, it is a burden. You wake up carrying knowledge no one else can see, and that means every interaction becomes loaded, every smile from the manipulative woman becomes a weapon, every innocent gesture from the one you overlooked becomes a source of guilt, and every opportunity to change things also reopens the wound of how badly you failed the first time. That is the emotional engine of this series, and it is why the title matters so much. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah, which can be felt in English as something like no longer the wrong miss, is not just about a heroine being finally chosen. It is about correcting a misrecognition at the center of an entire life. It is about seeing clearly after having once mistaken performance for love and kindness for weakness. It is about understanding that the wrong person is not simply a villain who arrived from nowhere, but a reflection of the hero's own blindness, vanity, desperation, and emotional immaturity in his first life. That makes the setup instantly more interesting, because Su Lin Feng, the central figure here, is not reborn as an innocent man cheated by fate. He is reborn as someone who participated in his own downfall, who handed power to the woman who ruined him, who ignored warnings, who misread sincerity, and who now has to live with the ugliness of that truth while trying to do better. That gives the series a bite that a lot of rebirth romances do not have. Instead of treating the past life as a mere excuse for cool reversals and strategic payback, it treats it as a moral scar. When we meet Su Lin Feng in the emotional memory of that ruined first life, he is the textbook heir on the surface, privileged, formidable, carrying the kind of status that makes rooms rearrange themselves around him. But the tragedy is that all his intelligence and all his power cannot save him from emotional deception. The woman he marries in that first version of his life is not just someone selfish. She is someone who knows exactly how to use his affection, his family situation, his vulnerabilities, and the expectations tied to his status in order to hollow him out from within. The story never needs to scream this point, because the whole series is built on the terrible afterimage of what she did. You feel her damage in the way he reacts to intimacy in his second chance, in the way he observes before he speaks, in the way certain phrases seem to physically tighten his body, and in the way love itself no longer feels simple or celebratory to him. Love has become a test, a trigger, and a responsibility. Then comes the rebirth mechanism, and I have to say, one thing the series does very smartly is that it does not spend forever explaining its supernatural rulebook. It understands the audience already knows the emotional contract. He gets another life. He returns before the marriage that destroyed him. He recognizes the trap. He decides this time he will not repeat it. Done. The show trusts the premise and moves immediately into the much more interesting terrain, which is choice. Not the grand abstract choice of good versus evil, but the social, intimate, humiliating, dangerous choice of refusing the woman everyone expects him to choose and turning instead toward Lincier, a woman whose purity initially sounds like it might reduce her to a tired trope, but thankfully the series gives that word more dignity than people might expect. Lincier is not pure because she is bland, passive, or unreal. She is pure in the old dramatic sense, meaning she carries emotional integrity. Her kindness does not fluctuate according to status. Her affection is not strategic. Her memory is rooted in feeling rather than performance. And perhaps most importantly, she has a quiet self-respect that keeps her from becoming a mere reward for the hero's repentance. That is crucial, because if this story were only about Su Linfeng getting a nicer woman the second time around, it would be thin. What gives it weight is that Lincier is bound to him by a childhood memory, by a tenderness he failed to understand in time, and by a history that has meaning whether or not he deserves access to it. Their connection is not presented like a cheap puzzle box twist. It grows with a softness that keeps folding the series back into its central ache. He had once already been loved in the right way, and he still chose wrong. That is devastating, and the show knows it. Without spoiling the major late reveals, because this is absolutely the kind of drama where uncovering the exact shape of memory matters, the broad setup is simple and powerful. In his previous life, Su Linfeng's marriage leads him into ruin. In his reborn life, he refuses to continue walking toward that same cliff. He identifies the manipulative pattern early, rejects the future that once destroyed him, and in the process begins turning toward Lincier, a young woman whose sincerity contrasts so sharply with the weaponized elegance of the woman he once married that the emotional axis of the story snaps into place almost immediately. But here is where the writing gets more interesting than just revenge fantasy. Su Linfeng does not instantly become emotionally healthy because he has the right target this time. He approaches his new life with urgency, calculation, suspicion, and a kind of desperate protectiveness that can be romantic in one scene and troubling in another. He is trying to rescue himself and her from a future only he remembers, and that creates natural tension, because from Lincier's perspective, this powerful heir suddenly sees her, chooses her, protects her, and at times seems to know things he should not know. The romance therefore develops under a cloud of asymmetrical knowledge, and instead of weakening the relationship, that tension gives it depth. She is not simply swept away by him. She studies him. She senses his pain before she fully understands it. She notices that his tenderness has fear inside it. And little by little, the series transforms what could have been a straightforward destiny romance into something richer, a relationship where one person is trying to earn in the present what he failed to honor in the past, and the other person has to decide whether she can trust the intensity of a man who seems to love her with the force of someone returning from a war. That makes the early episodes especially compelling. The opening stretch is probably where the series is at its most immediately addictive, because it gives you all the pleasure of reversal while grounding it in emotional stakes. The scenes where Su Linfeng refuses the old path are deeply satisfying, not because they play like triumphant one-liners, although there are definitely moments where his cold clarity cuts through the fake sweetness around him in a way viewers will love, but because each refusal feels like an act of survival. He is not merely teaching the villain a lesson. He is refusing to let his soul be repossessed. And that distinction matters. You can feel it in the way the camera often lingers on his face after a confrontation rather than ending on a dramatic sting. There is relief there, yes, but also grief, because every time he avoids an old trap, he is reminded that there was once a version of himself too lost to avoid it. The show keeps threading this pain into scenes that lesser dramas would treat as pure crowd-pleasing. So even when Su Linfeng seems several moves ahead of everybody else in a boardroom or family dispute, there is still an undertow of sorrow. He is not enjoying his superiority as much as he is outrunning a ghost. Then Lincier enters the emotional center of the series, and the temperature changes. Her scenes are often quieter, warmer, and more spatially intimate. Where the world of wealth, manipulation, and public expectation around Su Linfeng tends to be framed with colder symmetry, polished surfaces, and social pressure baked into every interaction, Cier's presence introduces breadth. Even when she is in the same rooms, the atmosphere changes because the performance changes. She does not compete for attention. She does not sharpen herself for display. She listens. She observes. She carries gentleness without looking naive, and that is harder to pull off than it sounds. A lot of dramas claim a heroine is good-hearted and then basically write her as a moral slogan. This series, to its credit, gives Lincier texture through restraint. She has the hardest kind of screen presence to write and perform, because it relies on us believing there is an inner life behind stillness. The actress sells that beautifully, especially in the moments where Sia realizes she is being seen in a way she never expected to be seen. There is surprise there, but also caution. She does not rush to interpret Su Linfeng's attention as salvation. She seems to intuit that people with his level of intensity are carrying storms she has not yet named. That instinct makes her compelling. She is not there just to be adored. She is there to discern. And the chemistry between them depends on that balance. Su Linfeng's attraction to Sia is shaped by memory, guilt, yearning, recognition, and the fragile hope that this time he can choose love before disaster teaches him its price. Sia's response, however, is built from the present tense. She has to judge the man in front of her, not the one he used to be or the one he fears becoming. So their romance becomes a meeting point between memory and reality, between a man carrying the weight of a future that already happened to him and a woman insisting, quietly but firmly, that sincerity must be lived now. That is one of the reasons the love story works. It is not just a reunion of souls. It is an argument between time frames. And because of that, even scenes of simple tenderness carry dramatic charge. A hand lingering too long. A question asked with unusual care. A childhood object reappearing. A look that says one character remembers more than the other understands. The show mines those little moments for all they are worth, and when it is in that mode, it is genuinely absorbing. Of course, no rebirth drama like this lives on tenderness alone. There has to be pressure, and the pressure here comes from both the obvious antagonist and the social ecosystem that allowed her influence to thrive the first time. The woman who destroyed Su Linfeng in his previous life, whether you read her as a straightforward villain or a more layered portrait of greed sharpened by survival instincts, is written as someone dangerously skilled at managing appearances. She knows how to weaponize femininity in a class-conscious world. She knows how to perform vulnerability when it serves her. She knows how to make other people's assumptions do half the work. And most importantly, she is accustomed to a version of Su Linfeng who once believed her. That means the reborn timeline is not only destabilizing for him, it is destabilizing for her, because power based on expected behavior collapses when the target of your manipulation suddenly stops acting according to script. The series gets a lot of mileage out of that shift. There is an almost thriller-like pleasure in watching her realize, slowly, that the man she thought she understood is no longer available to be steered. But again, what I appreciate is that the show does not turn every clash into cartoonish domination. Sometimes Su Linfeng's foreknowledge makes him seem untouchable, but just as often the series reminds us that knowing what happened once does not mean controlling everyone in a changed timeline. Different choices ripple outward. People react unpredictably. Emotions intervene. A second chance is not a replay. It is a dangerous variation. That is where suspense comes from. And because the story is rooted in business inheritance, family reputation, romantic expectation, and social surveillance, even relatively small emotional decisions can trigger wider consequences. A changed engagement can affect alliances. A public slight can become a rumor. A protective gesture can be interpreted as scandal. A recovered memory can rewrite years of misunderstanding. The world of the series is melodramatic, yes, but it understands cause and effect, and that helps keep the stakes alive. One of the strongest things about Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah is how clearly it grasps the emotional difference between revenge and repair. Su Linfeng obviously wants to avoid destruction. He also wants, at some level, to expose the woman who exploited him. But if the drama were powered only by revenge, it would burn out fast. What keeps it compelling is repair. He is trying to repair his judgment, his capacity for trust, his relationship to power, and his connection with someone he should have cherished long before he knew what losing her meant. That shift from retaliation to restoration gives the series a mature undertone beneath all its romantic plotting. It suggests that what he truly wants is not to watch his enemy suffer, though that may be satisfying in measured doses, but to become someone capable of choosing rightly and loving cleanly. That is a much bigger journey, and the show wisely lets it take time. In fact, one of the more emotionally credible aspects of the script is that Su Linfeng's love for Lincier initially contains traces of guilt and compensation. He is not pure in his motives at first. He sees in her the person he failed, the person connected to an innocence he once misidentified, the person who represents the life he could have had. That is powerful, but it is also unfair if left unexamined. The series does examine it. It pushes him toward a place where loving Xie cannot just mean correcting a ledger. He has to stop treating her as a symbolic redemption and start meeting her as a full human being in the present. That transition is subtle, and I think it is one of the reasons the romance earns more than the setup alone would suggest. He does not merely transfer his devotion from one woman to another. He undergoes a painful recalibration of what devotion even means. On the performance side, the actor playing Su Linfeng does a lot of heavy lifting with stillness, and that is exactly what this role needs. If he played the reborn heir as swaggering and all-knowing from beginning to end, the character would flatten into fantasy. Instead, there is a tremor under his control. Even in scenes where he is decisive, there is often the sense that he is bracing against memory. His eyes do that useful drama thing where they seem to arrive in a room half a second before the rest of him, as if he is always scanning for recurrence. When the writing gives him grand confrontational lines, he delivers them with enough restraint that they feel protective rather than theatrical. But where he really lands the character is in quieter moments, especially when Su Linfeng is alone after making the right choice. Those are the moments where the mask drops just enough for us to see exhaustion, guilt, or fear. It is easy to act haunted by shouting. It is harder to act haunted by holding your breath for too long, and he understands that. Meanwhile, the actress playing Lincier gives exactly the kind of grounded, luminous performance this role demands. She never overplays innocence. She gives Xie a moral steadiness that feels lived in, not decorative. There is strength in the way she withholds judgment, in the way she lets emotion register across her face in small waves instead of dramatic explosions, and in the way she gradually opens towards Su Linfeng without ever losing the sense that she is evaluating the truth of him. Their chemistry is not based on chaotic banter or overt sensuality at first. It is based on recognition, on relief, on the emotional pull of someone feeling strangely familiar before the mind can explain why. That kind of chemistry can be difficult to sustain, but the series uses pacing and visual language to nurture it. They are often framed with a slight distance before that distance slowly collapses over time. Their scenes move from guarded conversation to mutual shelter, from the tension of being watched by others to the intimacy of being understood by one another. You feel the relationship becoming safer, and because safety is something Su Linfeng lost in such a catastrophic way, that progression becomes deeply romantic. The antagonist, or perhaps more accurately the would-be wife from the doomed timeline, is also crucial to why the series works, because she embodies not just temptation but misrecognition. She is not only evil in the simplistic sense of wanting wealth or status. She represents a whole structure of values built on image management, opportunism, and the ability to mimic emotional authenticity long enough to secure power. The actress playing her seems to understand that the scariest thing about this kind of character is composure. She smiles at the right times. She lowers her voice at the right times. She knows exactly when to appear vulnerable and when to appear indispensable. In another universe, with weaker writing, this character could easily become too broad, but here she is most effective when the performance lets us see the panic behind the polish. Her confusion as Su Linfeng slips beyond her control becomes one of the show's pleasures. She is a woman who built her strategy on reading the room, and now the room contains a man who has seen her ending. There is something deliciously unsettling about that dynamic. Supporting characters, too, help the story breathe. The family elders and corporate figures around Su Linfeng function as more than decorative obstacles. They represent the pressures that made his first mistake possible, the value system that confuses prestige with suitability, obedience with virtue, and polished ambition with reliability. Some of them begin by favoring the wrong woman precisely because she performs the role expected of her in that world. Lincier, by contrast, can seem too soft, too plain, too emotionally transparent for those who mistake strategic coolness for strength. Watching that perception shift is one of the quieter satisfactions of the series. There are also usually one or two confidants in dramas like this: the loyal assistant, the observant friend, the relative who notices the hero's behavior has changed in ways they cannot explain, and while these supporting roles are not revolutionary, they are used well enough to create texture. They give Su Linfeng someone to bounce his altered behavior off of, and they give the audience perspective on just how shocking his choices appear from the outside. That outside view matters, because if everyone simply accepted his sudden devotion to Siye, the emotional reality would feel too easy. Instead, the series lets his new path generate skepticism, gossip, and strategic resistance. That keeps the romance from floating free of consequence. Visually, Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah understands contrast, and for a drama built on old mistakes and new choices, contrast is everything. The aesthetic language does not need to reinvent television to be effective. What it does is align mood with emotional truth. The world associated with the false wife and the damaged first timeline often feels colder, glossier, and more performative. Clean interiors, measured compositions, social gatherings where everybody is perfectly dressed and nobody is emotionally safe, boardroom spaces where power is visible in every line of furniture and every glass surface, all of that creates a sense of beauty without comfort. Then, when the story shifts toward Lincier and the fragile possibility of a different life, the color temperature often softens, the frames breathe a little more, and the visual emphasis moves toward faces, hands, and the little pauses that make intimacy feel earned. Even the flashbacks, or memory fragments, carry their own texture. Childhood recollection in this series is not just nostalgia. It is almost mythic. A small kindness in the past is filmed with the weight of lost scripture. A remembered phrase can land like a key turning in a locked room. That heightened emotional cinematography fits the genre perfectly because this is not realism in the strict sense, it is melodrama elevated by sincerity. And I think the series knows exactly how much that matters. It never apologizes for feeling deeply. It never winks at the audience as if to say, yes, we know this is dramatic. It commits. And that commitment is what allows scenes that could have been ridiculous in a more cynical production to become moving here. The music helps too. You can hear the score doing a lot of emotional translation, especially in scenes where the characters cannot say what they know or what they remember. Themes recur in ways that make emotional recognition almost Pavlovian, which can be manipulative in a cheap show, but here it feels mostly earned because the story is built around recurrence. A melody returning in a different context mirrors the whole dramatic premise. The past comes back altered. A memory once ignored becomes meaningful. A gesture that meant nothing the first time becomes everything the second time. The soundtrack leans into longing, but it also knows when to drop out and let silence do the work. Some of the strongest scenes are powerful precisely because you can hear restraint, a breath, a shift in fabric, the absence of speech in a room where too much is being felt. Emotionally, the series works because it understands that regret is not loud all the time. Sometimes it is a tiny pause before saying someone's name. Sometimes it is a hand stopping itself from reaching out. Sometimes it is gratitude so intense it almost resembles grief. Su Linfeng's entire second life is colored by this kind of emotion. Even moments of happiness feel fragile because he knows how easily they can vanish. That makes his tenderness toward Lincier especially moving when the show lets it be simple. There are scenes where he protects her, certainly, and fans of the genre will get the satisfaction they want from those moments, but the deeper romance often lies in gentler things, the way he listens more carefully to her than anyone else does, the way his voice changes around her, the way he seems almost astonished whenever she trusts him a little more. It is not the confidence of a man collecting a prize. It is the humility of a man being allowed back into the vicinity of something sacred. That is why the childhood memory motif is so effective. In a lesser series, the revelation that the heroine shared meaningful childhood moments with the hero would function as a simple destiny stamp, proof that they were always meant to be. Here, it lands as accusation and mercy at the same time. Accusation, because he once failed to remember correctly. Mercy, because life has inexplicably offered him a chance to remember better. The emotional force of that idea is huge. It turns what could have been a cliché into a meditation on how identity can be shaped by what we misremember and whom we miscredit. The show is essentially asking, how much of your life can go wrong because you recognized the wrong person? That question resonates far beyond romance. It touches class, ambition, family expectation, self-deception, and the stories people tell themselves in order to survive. In that sense, the title is almost philosophical. No longer the wrong miss does not simply refer to getting the bride right. It refers to repairing one's entire relationship to perception. Another thing I appreciated is that Lincier is not written as someone whose value only becomes visible because a wealthy man chooses her. The series works hard, in small ways, to show that her integrity already exists independent of his gaze. She has her own emotional weather, her own private memories, her own hesitations, and her own moral line. That matters tremendously because the easiest mistake for a story like this would be to make her a passive vessel for the hero's redemption arc. Instead, she becomes the emotional standard by which the story judges everyone else. Around her, other characters reveal themselves. The manipulative woman's artificiality becomes clearer. Su Linfeng's growth or lack of growth becomes visible. The family's values are exposed. Even the pacing of scenes changes when Xie is present because she slows the story down just enough to let sincerity register. There is a beautiful confidence in that choice. The writers trust that stillness can be dramatic when the stakes are emotional enough. And they are. One of the most compelling aspects of Xie's characterization is that she does not need to dominate a room to alter its moral gravity. She enters quietly and shifts the emotional truth of a scene. That is hard to write and hard to perform, but when it works, it creates the kind of heroine people remember. And I think that is why audience reaction to her has likely been so warm. Viewers are tired of female leads who are either written as helpless saints or hyper-competent machines with no vulnerability. Xie lands in a more human place. She is gentle, perceptive, hurt-able, and dignified. She can be uncertain without being weak. She can receive love without collapsing into dependency. That balance gives the romance room to breathe. Now, no drama is perfect, and Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah does have moments where genre convenience shows through. There are stretches, especially in the middle, where some business conflicts feel more functional than fully textured. Certain side characters exist primarily to carry information, provoke misunderstandings, or delay emotional resolution. If you are deeply invested in airtight corporate plotting, this may not be the show that fully satisfies that appetite, because the business empire backdrop is ultimately there to externalize power, inheritance, and vulnerability more than to deliver intricate economic realism. But honestly, that is not a flaw so much as a prioritization. This series knows what it is. It is not trying to become a procedural about mergers and acquisitions. It is using wealth and succession as emotional pressure cookers. The company is the arena where trust becomes visible, where betrayal has public cost, and where romantic choices intersect with status. As long as you understand that, the drama's focus makes sense. There are also a few moments where the antagonist's scheming approaches the edges of melodramatic excess, but even there, the emotional framing usually keeps things grounded enough that the tension remains enjoyable rather than exhausting. And if anything, that heightened energy is part of the appeal. This is a series that embraces dramatic reversals, charged confrontations, and the delicious agony of people standing inches from truths they do not yet fully understand. It would lose some of its identity if it became too restrained. Where I think it really distinguishes itself is in pacing emotional payoff. A lot of rebirth romances front-load their best material. The hook is incredible, the initial revenge is satisfying, and then the middle falls into repetitive misunderstandings. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah is smarter than that. Yes, the opening is sharp, but the series keeps deepening its emotional logic as it goes. Each new movement is not just another obstacle. It is another layer of recognition. We move from immediate strategic reversal into relational trust, from relational trust into memory, from memory into moral reckoning, and from moral reckoning into the larger question of whether a corrected life can ever truly be free of the first life's shadow. That progression gives the story momentum. You are not simply waiting for the villain to be defeated or the couple to confess. You are watching a man try to build a future while carrying proof that futures can collapse. That is more interesting than the average genre setup, and it gives even familiar beats a heavier emotional texture. The series also knows how to use delay effectively. There are conversations that almost happen, recognitions that almost complete themselves, emotional truths that hover just beyond articulation, and instead of feeling cheap, many of these delays work because they reflect the inner state of the characters. Su Linfeng is not withholding because the script needs 6 more episodes. He is withholding because he is terrified of sounding insane, manipulative, or self-serving. Lincier is cautious not because the script wants to frustrate us, but because a woman with self-respect would naturally question such sudden intensity. The best melodrama turns delay into character, and this series often manages that. Themes-wise, there is a lot to chew on if you enjoy stories that hide moral questions inside emotional hooks. The most obvious theme is second chances, but the show refuses to romanticize them as a magic eraser. Second chances here demand accountability. They ask whether knowledge alone is enough to change behavior. They ask whether a person can return to the same social world and actually make different choices when all the old temptations, pressures, and blind spots still exist. That is why Su Linfeng remains compelling. He is not simply smarter now. He is wounded now. He is chastened now. He is capable of cruelty in the name of protection, of overreach in the name of care, of emotional urgency that can veer toward desperation. His growth lies not just in avoiding the wrong woman, but in learning how not to instrumentalize the right one. That is a deeper and rarer arc than the premise initially suggests. Then there is the theme of memory itself. The story is fascinated by what memory authorizes and what it distorts. A remembered betrayal can protect you, but it can also harden you. A remembered kindness can guide you, but it can also become an idealized fantasy if you are not careful. The past, in this show, is both compass and trap. That duality gives the rebirth conceit emotional seriousness. Su Linfeng's greatest advantage is also his greatest injury. He sees more clearly than anyone else, but he sees through pain. The series keeps asking whether clear sight without emotional healing is enough. The answer, wisely, is no. He needs more than information. He needs transformation. And that transformation only becomes possible through his relationship with Lincier, not because she is some magical healer whose job is to fix him, but because loving her truthfully requires him to stop living entirely in reaction to his previous life. That is the subtle genius of the romantic arc. Lincier does not save him by being a saint. She saves the possibility of his better self by requiring presence. There is also a class and image component running through everything. The wrong woman in the first life thrives because the world around Su Linfeng is designed to reward appearance, calculation, and socially legible ambition. Lincier's value is easier to overlook precisely because sincerity is not flashy capital in elite circles. That gives the love story a quiet social critique. It suggests that emotional intelligence and moral clarity are often dismissed by systems obsessed with status performance. Su Linfeng's first failure, then, is not just personal. It is shaped by the class-coded environment he inhabits, one that teaches him what to admire and whom to trust. His rebirth becomes a chance not only to choose differently but to see the moral poverty of the values that once guided him. That is why the title resonates culturally. Many viewers are drawn to stories about correcting romantic mistakes, yes, but what this series really taps into is the fantasy of revising one's miseducation. Not just choosing a different partner, but becoming a person who can finally identify what real worth looks like. I also want to talk about masculinity in this series, because Su Linfeng is written in a way that complicates the usual alpha heir stereotype. He has the commanding presence, the financial power, the strategic mind, all the genre essentials, but what defines him emotionally is not invincibility. It is damage. He is a man who has learned that power cannot prevent intimate betrayal, and that knowledge makes him both sharper and more fragile. The performance wisely leans into that contradiction. He can shut down a room, but he is visibly more uncertain in moments of tenderness than in moments of confrontation. That tells us a lot. Public power is easy for him. Private trust is the real risk. The show therefore creates a version of masculinity where emotional vulnerability is not framed as weakness but as the final terrain of courage. It is easier for him to expose a rival than to tell Lincier why seeing her feels like returning to something he lost before he understood its worth. That emotional asymmetry makes him more human. It also helps explain the series' appeal to viewers who want romance with actual interior stakes. Meanwhile, the female characters create a fascinating spectrum of survival strategies. The antagonist survives by mastering appearance, by making herself legible to a system that rewards strategic femininity. Sia survives through integrity, empathy, and quiet endurance. Neither approach is presented as socially easy, but the show clearly places its moral faith in the latter. Still, because the antagonist is allowed intelligence and composure, the conflict never feels entirely trivial. She is dangerous precisely because the world has taught her what works. That nuance, even when delivered through melodrama, gives the series more bite than a simplistic good girl versus bad girl setup. In terms of audience reaction, it is not hard to see why Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah would find a strong following in 2026. This is the era of emotionally intense, high-concept romance dramas traveling far beyond their original markets through clipped scenes, fan edits, and subtitles shared at incredible speed. A show like this is built for that ecosystem because it delivers immediate premise clarity, strong visual contrast, addictive emotional hooks, and scenes that can be isolated into devastating little viral moments, a reversal at a public event, a line that reframes an old memory, a look of recognition, a protective gesture that suddenly carries the weight of 2 lifetimes, an antagonist realizing she no longer holds the cards she thought she held. But what makes people stay after the clips is the emotional consistency. The series is not just a trailer-worthy premise stretched thin. It understands the long game of longing. Online, I can easily imagine viewers debating whether Su Linfeng's initial pursuit of Xie is romantic or too burdened by guilt, arguing over the villain's psychology, replaying scenes where childhood memory and present tenderness finally connect, and celebrating the heroine for being written with more self-possession than the trope first suggests. These are the kinds of dramas that create fandom not just because they are pretty, but because they invite interpretation. People want to talk about whether fate brought them together or whether moral growth did. They want to ask if a second chance can ever truly belong to the present. They want to compare the emotional honesty of the central relationship to the poisonous glamour of the false one. That conversational afterlife is part of the cultural footprint of a series now. And this one seems designed to generate exactly that. Culturally, the rebirth romance trend continues to hit because it merges 3 universal desires into one package. The desire for justice, the desire for love, and the desire to redo what pain has already taught us too late. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah taps all 3, but it stands out because it does not flatten regret into mere motivation. It lets regret remain painful. It does not say, "You suffered, now here is the better girl as reward." It says, "You suffered, and now you must prove that suffering taught you how to see." That distinction is why the series feels more emotionally nourishing than some of its peers. It offers fantasy, but a fantasy disciplined by moral memory. And I think that speaks to audiences now, especially people who are tired of stories where redemption comes too easily. We want characters who get another chance, yes, but we also want them to understand what that chance costs. We want romance that feels chosen, not merely assigned by plot. We want tenderness that has survived knowledge. This series gives you that. Even its title feels almost corrective in a broader sense. No longer The Wrong Miss can be read as a romantic fix, but it also resonates with anyone who has ever misjudged a person, misread a situation, or pursued the socially validated option while ignoring the one that was actually true. That is a human mistake far bigger than melodrama, and the show knows it. There is also something refreshing about how unironic the emotional register is. A lot of modern content, especially content chasing online audiences, becomes afraid of sincerity. It undercuts itself, jokes at its own expense, or treats earnest emotion like a liability. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah goes the other way. It says no, we are going to make you feel this. We are going to treat a remembered kindness like treasure. We are going to let silence hold heartbreak. We are going to let a man's remorse be visible in the way he protects the woman he once failed to recognize. We're going to stage social humiliation and private tenderness with equal seriousness. That kind of confidence is rare, and when a show earns it, the result can be surprisingly powerful. You start watching for plot and stay because the emotional language is consistent. Even when the twists are familiar, the feeling behind them lands. If I had to point to what finally makes this series memorable, I would say it is the way it turns correction into devotion. So many second-chance narratives are obsessed with fixing outcomes, but this one is interested in fixing perception. Su Linfeng is not just changing whom he marries. He is changing the way he understands love, loyalty, and value. Lincier is not just a more suitable partner. She is the person who forces him to confront the depth of his previous blindness. The antagonist is not just a bad choice. She is the embodiment of everything he once mistook for care. That triad gives the drama its symbolic charge. Each character is a path, a worldview, a relationship to truth. And because the series keeps those emotional ideas active underneath the romance, it feels fuller than its genre shell. I also appreciate that the show does not rush to make Lincier responsible for healing everything. There is a temptation in stories like this to turn the heroine into an emotional hospital where the damaged man checks in and emerges cured. Instead, Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah allows healing to remain incomplete, relational, and ongoing. Sia offers steadiness, yes, but Su Linfeng still has to face himself. He still has to reckon with how much of his old life was built on vanity and assumption. He still has to learn that protecting someone is not the same as possessing the right to decide everything for them. Those lessons matter. They keep the romance from curdling into paternalistic fantasy. The best scenes between them are often the ones where Sia quietly reorients him, not by lecturing, but by existing as someone whose dignity cannot be absorbed into his agenda. That is where love becomes partnership rather than compensation. The pacing of Confession, too, deserves credit. The series understands that in a story built on memory, saying the truth out loud is not merely romantic. It is existential. To confess love here is also to confess error, to admit history, to reveal a version of oneself shaped by pain that the other person never witnessed. That is why the emotional threshold is so high. When characters in this show finally articulate what has been hovering between them, it feels like more than a genre requirement. It feels like crossing from survival into honesty. Those are the moments that linger. And without giving away how the series resolves its biggest questions, I will say this: it is wise enough to understand that a satisfying ending in a story like this cannot just punish the villain and reward the couple. It has to honor the weight of having once lived wrongly. It has to acknowledge that the sweetness of getting it right is inseparable from the memory of having gotten it catastrophically wrong. That bittersweetness is part of the appeal. Purely happy stories can be lovely, but stories touched by earned grief often stay with you longer. Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah understands that. It knows that joy after regret has a different texture. It trembles. It disbelieves itself. It looks over its shoulder. And because of that, when tenderness finally feels safe, it feels monumental. From a review standpoint, then, I would say this is a drama that succeeds not because it invents a brand new plot architecture, but because it deepens a familiar one with emotional seriousness, strong central performances, careful use of contrast, and a surprisingly rich understanding of how memory changes love. It gives viewers the immediate satisfactions of the genre, the rejected wrong match, the strategic reversals, the protective hero, the understated but emotionally resonant heroine, the poisonous social atmosphere, the childhood connection that blooms into present recognition, but it layers all of that with something more mournful and thoughtful. It lets the second life remain haunted. It lets romance emerge not from naivete but from knowledge. It lets desire be mixed with remorse until remorse itself transforms into a more truthful kind of devotion. That is why it works. That is why scenes from it will replay in people's minds long after the exact mechanics of the plot blur. They will remember the feeling of a man who has seen his own ruin and therefore treats every small kindness like a miracle. They will remember a woman whose gentleness feels stronger than social strategy. They will remember the ache of realizing that the right person was once already there, quietly waiting to be seen. They will remember the shock of watching someone finally refuse the script that once destroyed him. And maybe, if the series has really done its job, they will remember their own wrong turns for a moment too. Because that is the hidden power of stories like this. They make melodrama personal. They let us project our own missed signs, our own misplaced trust, our own fantasy that if life gave us one more chance at the moment everything tilted wrong, we might choose with clearer eyes. Not because we would suddenly become smarter than everyone else, but because pain would have taught us what appearances cannot. Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah captures that fantasy beautifully. It is tender without being soft-headed, dramatic without losing emotional logic, familiar in premise yet distinctive in feeling. It understands the thrill of correction, the danger of obsession, the seduction of polished lies, and the extraordinary emotional force of being truly recognized after once being overlooked. It gives Su Linfeng a compelling path from wounded certainty to humbled love, and it gives Lincier the grace, intelligence, and self-possession necessary to make that path worth watching. It delivers a villain who is not just there to be hated, but to illuminate the hero's old blindness and the world's skewed values. It uses style to sharpen emotion rather than distract from it. And most importantly, it trusts viewers to care about sincerity. In a media landscape crowded with noise, that trust feels almost radical. So if you are wondering whether this 2026 title is worth your time, my answer is yes, especially if you like romances where the emotional stakes are built not only on attraction but on history, misrecognition, guilt, and the fragile miracle of getting one impossible chance to love more truthfully than before. It is the kind of series that reminds you why the rebirth trope endures. Not because we all want to be overpowered geniuses in a second timeline, but because deep down, so many of us understand the ache of seeing too late. This story takes that ache and turns it into a cinematic, emotionally immersive ride through wealth, memory, manipulation, tenderness, and the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, a person can come back from being wrong in the most intimate way and learn how to choose right. And by the time it settles into its final emotional rhythm, you are no longer just watching Su Linfeng move away from the woman who destroyed him. You are watching him crawl, slowly and imperfectly, toward the version of himself who might actually deserve Lincier. That difference is everything. That is why the series hits. That is why its emotional aftertaste lingers. And that is why, when I think about Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah, I do not just think of a rebirth romance. I think of a story about recognition as redemption, about love as corrected vision, and about how sometimes the most moving thing a drama can offer is not the promise that fate will fix everything, but the hard-won hope that if the heart is broken deeply enough to finally learn, then maybe on the next try it will know whom to hold and whom to let go. Some films open like a thunderclap, but Tak lagi jadi Nona yang Salah feels more like waking up from a long, painful dream and realizing that, somehow, you've been given one more morning with the sun. From the first frame, it pulls you into the aching, intimate question at the heart of the story: if you were granted a second life, not with a clean slate, but with every scar and mistake from your past burned into your memory, would you truly live differently, or would you just rearrange your regrets into a prettier pattern? Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. So let's talk about this 2026 reincarnation melodrama, because on the surface you can describe it in one clean sentence: Su Linfeng, heir to a massive business empire, is destroyed in one life by the wife who uses him, and when he's reborn with all his memories, he decides this time he won't fall for that trap and instead chooses Lincier, the pure girl who once shared innocent childhood memories with him. But that summary doesn't begin to capture how this story feels when you're actually watching it. The movie lives in the spaces between those plot beats, in the way a hand trembles before signing a contract, in the hesitation of a man who sees the face of the woman who ruined him and has to pretend it's the first time they've met, in the quiet heartbeat skipped when he walks past a dessert shop and is suddenly transported back to the echo of a little girl's laughter on the other side of a garden wall. It's not interested in the fireworks of reincarnation, the fantasy spectacle. It's obsessed with the emotional hangover of living twice. We open on death, not in a grotesque, gory way, but in this strangely calm, suffocating stillness. Su Linfeng, in his first life, is lying on the polished floor of the vast office that once symbolized victory and now feels like a mausoleum. Papers are scattered, the lights flicker, and his last sight is the silhouette of the woman he trusted most walking away from him, heels clicking, voice like ice as she says something along the lines of, "You really thought love was enough?" It's not shouted, Not melodramatic, just cruelly matter-of-fact. The camera doesn't dwell on his blood or his body, it lingers on his eyes, clouded with disbelief more than pain. And then things go dark, completely dark, the kind of black screen that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing. Over that darkness, we hear a heartbeat, faint at first, then stronger, and then the muffled sounds of a world that hasn't happened yet, traffic, distant conversation, a child laughing somewhere off-screen. When the image returns, we're in a different time but the same city, younger, more alive, full of possibility. And we're back with Su Lin Feng, but he's not the broken man on the floor anymore. He's waking up in a hospital bed, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface, eyes wild, hand shaking as he grabs his own chest, half expecting to find a fatal wound still there. The nurse rushes over, concerned, but he can barely hear her. Because in his head, the timeline has snapped. He remembers everything, all the way up to his last breath, and yet his body is years younger. The film doesn't dump an exposition monologue here. Instead, it lets you feel the disorientation with him, the way his gaze darts around the room, registering tiny details, the year on a calendar, the face of an older family driver he knows should be dead by now, the vibration of his phone with a ringtone he hasn't heard in over a decade. It's like seeing a ghost realize he's alive. And in that confusion, there's this devastating, barely voiced thought, I have to do it all again. Not, I get to, not, I'm saved, but, I have to. That's the first sign that this film understands reincarnation not as a prize but as a burden. From there, the narrative slowly reveals how his past life collapsed. We learn, in fragments, that Su Lin Feng wasn't some naive idiot. He was smart, driven, but deeply insecure, desperate to prove himself worthy of the empire inherited from a cold, distant father. The woman he married in that first life, who, in this new timeline, is still just a presence hovering in the periphery, is sharp, charismatic, exactly the kind of partner the world expects him to have. She knows how to play the social game, how to flatter his ego while subtly steering his decisions, how to present herself as the supportive wife while slowly tightening the leash around his neck. Their downfall wasn't some sudden betrayal, it was a long series of compromises he made because he mistook her ambition for shared vision, her control for care. When he wakes up in this life, he wakes up right around the time when his relationship with her is only just beginning to form, the early stages, the first invitations, the organic, accidental, meetings arranged by family friends. To everyone else, she is the perfect match, to him, she is a wolf in a beautifully tailored coat, and watching him navigate that is one of the early tensions of the film. You see him in scenes that would have played out so differently before, a family dinner where two sets of parents are clearly orchestrating a meeting, a charity event where she appears across the room in a shimmering dress, smiling like she owns the space. In his first life, this is where his heartbeat would spike with attraction, where he'd gravitate toward her like a moth to a flame. In this life, you can see the cold sweat at his temples, the way his fingers tighten around his glass, the thin veneer of politeness he uses to mask the revulsion and fear boiling underneath. Because to him, she's not a stranger, she's the end of the road. And this time, he wants a different destination. But here's the thing, for a while, he doesn't know what that different destination looks like. The film doesn't present his decision to choose Lincier instead as an instant lightning bolt epiphany. At first, all he knows is what he doesn't want. He doesn't want the same deal, the same marriage, the same compromises. He's like a man who's seen the last page of a book and violently refuses to read it again, but hasn't yet figured out what new story he can write. That's where Lincier comes in, not as a magical solution dropped into his lap, but as a presence from his deepest, most innocent past that he literally stumbles upon. Their re-meet in this life is almost mundane on the surface. No dramatic car accident, no savior moment. He's driving back from a tense, suffocating family event, his brain buzzing with the echoes of his father's stiff lectures about alliances and legacies, when he stops at a red light and sees, out of the corner of his eye, a girl on a bicycle wobbling dangerously as a stack of cake boxes start slipping from her basket. One of them hits the asphalt and explodes in a small cloud of cream and sponge. She comes to a clumsy stop, half laughing, half groaning at her own bad luck, kneeling down in the street to try to salvage what she can. The light turns green. The cars behind him honk. He should drive. In his first life, he probably would have. he was too wrapped up in his own stress to pay attention to some random girl's mishap on the road. But this time, for reasons he doesn't even fully understand yet, he puts the car in park and gets out. As he moves toward her, the sound design shifts. We hear, layered underneath the city noise, faint traces of children giggling, summer cicadas, the thump of small feet running across worn concrete. The film is telling us, something in him already recognizes her, long before his conscious mind catches up. When he reaches out a hand to help her pick up the ruined cake box, their fingers brush, and there is this tiny, sharp cut to a childhood memory, the same hands, smaller. Passing a piece of almond cake through a hole in a garden wall. It's blink and you miss it, more like a flash of déjà vu than a full revelation. But it's enough. Lincier, flustered and embarrassed, tries to laugh it off, apologizing to him for making him get out of his fancy car, and promising she won't hold up the traffic anymore. She has no idea who he is. She doesn't care about his last name, his status, he's just the guy whose shoes I probably got frosting on. Her eyes are bright, her hair a mess, her t-shirt stained with cream. And for Su Lin Feng, who has spent 2 lifetimes suffocating in polished spaces full of calculated smiles, there's something almost painful about how uncurated she is. He helps her pick up what's left, listens as she jokes self-deprecatingly about her doomed mission to deliver cakes, and when she bikes off, he stands there for a moment longer than he needs to, watching her weave through the traffic like a slightly chaotic beam of sunlight. At this point, he doesn't yet connect her to his childhood. That realization comes later. Initially, she's just an imprint, a lingering question mark in his mind as he returns to the life he remembers and resents, boardrooms, reports, meetings to plan the exact chain of events that led to his downfall last time. The film shows us how those events start lining up like dominoes, ready to fall in the same cursed order. The same deputy manager approaches him with the same proposal that will later turn into a scandal. The same elder relative invites him out for drinks, subtly testing how easy he'll be to manipulate. The same legal loopholes are mentioned in hushed tones. As an audience, you get that prickly, anxious feeling of watching someone navigate a maze they already know leads to a dead end. But now, because he's seen it, because he's died at the end of it, he starts shoving those dominoes out of alignment. Refusing deals, quietly rotating personnel, taking files home that he never bothered to read in detail the first time. In those scenes, you can really feel the weight of having lived twice. He's not just making better choices, he's fighting his own reflexes. There are moments when habit pulls at him, when the temptation to slip back into autopilot almost wins, and then some sensory trigger, a name, a date, a phrase, shocks him back into awareness like a slap. And floating in the background of that growing storm is the memory of the girl with the bike and the ruined cake. He starts seeing her around town more than probability would suggest. Once in line at a cheap noodle shop, where she's arguing with the owner about a wrong order but ends up laughing and accepting it anyway. Once at a small community fair, where she's manning a booth and giving out free samples of pastries to kids, letting them smear frosting on her apron while their parents apologize and she waves it off. In a lesser drama, these encounters might feel contrived, but the movie sells it by anchoring everything in the geography of the city. We slowly realize she lives and works in areas his family's company plans to redevelop. Their lives are crossing not because of cosmic plot convenience, but because he, in both lives, has been standing on the side of the bulldozer, while she's lived her whole life in the neighborhoods under its shadow. That contrast becomes one of the film's strongest undercurrents, and it's part of what keeps this romance from becoming a simple, rich man saves poor girl, fantasy. The more he pays attention to her world, the more he's forced to reckon with what his presence, his family name, actually means there. The turning point in his connection to her childhood comes one rainy afternoon. He's following a hunch, chasing this nagging feeling that he's missing something important, and he ends up driving to the old family estate where he grew up, a massive house set back behind high walls, now mostly empty because his father prefers a modern penthouse in the city. The grounds are unkempt, the once pristine garden overgrown. He walks alone past the cracked stone pathways, letting rain soak through his suit, and his feet take him, almost on their own, toward the back wall. On the other side, or what used to be the other side, is an old, modest residential block. In his first life, by this point in time, That entire area had already been demolished to make way for one of his company's glass and steel monstrosities. But in this earlier timeline, fragments of it are still there, low, cramped buildings with laundry hanging out on rusted rails, potted plants lined up like soldiers on narrow windowsills. And there, halfway along the wall, he sees it, a broken brick, a small gap just big enough for a pair of child-sized hands to pass something through. The second his fingers touch that crack, the film drops us into his memory without warning. We're suddenly small, the camera lower to the ground, the colors brighter. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, is standing on a crate, peeking over the top of the wall, his face lit with a kind of fierce, cautious hope. On the other side, a girl of the same age stands back a little, shy at first, then stepping forward with a small plate in her hands. On the plate, lumpy, imperfect almond cakes. She tells him her name is Lincier and that she made them with her mom, and asks if, young master, wants to try one. He's not supposed to talk to people from over the wall. He knows this, he's been scolded before. But he's so lonely in that big cold house that the sight of another child feels like a miracle. He takes the cake, bites into it, and his entire face changes, not because it's gourmet or special, but because it tastes like someone thought of him. The memory is quick, more of a sense impression than a full sequence, but it hits him like a truck. Back in the present, under the rain, his breath stutters. He whispers her name, Lincier, like a prayer, and everything clicks. The girl with the bike, the ruined cake, the laugh that felt like déjà vu, it was her. It has always been her. The film doesn't sentimentalize this realization. There's no cheesy beam of light from the sky. Instead, we see the realization bring with it not only awe, but guilt. Because now he remembers something else, how that childhood connection ended. How his family found out, how he was punished for lowering himself, how he stood on his side of the wall, hands clenched, listening to his father's men threatening to evict the families on the other side if he didn't stop talking to those people. How he chose comfort over courage, silence over resistance. How, in one terrible moment, he turned his back on that little girl and pretended not to hear her when she called his name over and over, because he was scared. That scar sits under everything now. His reincarnation doesn't just give him a chance to choose the right girl this time, it forces him to confront the fact that he was the first one to abandon her. Long before any wife betrayed him. So when he approaches Lincier in this life, drawn by that recognition, it's not just romantic longing, it's a man mourning the boy he used to be and the hurt he caused without even understanding it. He starts frequenting the dessert shop where she works, at first awkwardly, then more comfortably, always ordering the same almond cake. It takes a few visits before she even registers him as more than a mildly weird regular customer. When she finally asks, half joking, if he ever gets tired of the same thing, he smiles and says, "Some flavors are worth returning to." It's a cheesy line, but the way he says it, soft, almost reverent, gives it weight. He doesn't tell her about the wall yet. He doesn't tell her that every bite of that cake feels like a tiny act of penance. Instead, he just watches her, learns the rhythm of her days, the way she hums under her breath when she's focused, the way she gets absent-mindedly protective of her co-workers. The more he observes, the clearer it becomes that her goodness is not some saintly, static thing. It's a choice she makes, again and again, often at a cost. She bites back snarky retorts to rude customers and then goes into the back room to breathe out her frustration into a dish towel. She loans money she barely has to a friend in trouble and then eats instant noodles for a week to cover the gap. She stays up late practicing new recipes not because she dreams of fame, but because she wants the shop's elderly owner, who she calls Auntie, to have something fresh to offer in the face of the big franchise cafes inching closer down the street. She is not naive, she's fully aware of how precarious her world is. But she chooses, over and over, not to let that fear harden her. That's what draws him in, not some abstract purity, but her courage to stay soft in a brutal environment. Meanwhile, his other life, his life as the heir, is pressing in, demanding his attention. His father, who in his first life died proud of the strong, strategic son he raised, is now a living, breathing figure again, with harsh words, tired eyes, and a worldview carved by decades of ruthless competition. Their scenes together are some of the most quietly tense in the film. Imagine sitting across from a man who you both resent and miss, knowing exactly how your relationship ended last time, but unable to tell him, in the life where you died, you never once told me you were proud of me without using it as leverage. There's a bittersweet layer running through their arguments now. Every time his father belittles Linfeng's idealism, we see the son flinch, but we also see a flicker of something softer in the older man's gaze when he thinks the boy isn't looking. It's like the film is telling us, even villains in our personal narratives are more complex when you see them a second time. And yet, change here is harder. Su Linfeng can choose a different partner, a different set of business ethics, but he can't single-handedly rewrite his father's soul. That's another grounded thread the film refuses to let go of. Second chances are personal, not universal. The world doesn't reset just because you did. As Su Linfeng tries to balance his emerging feelings for Lincier with the looming storm of corporate politics, the film begins to blur the lines between his desire for a different romantic future and his desire for a different moral identity. He doesn't just want to avoid marrying the woman who betrayed him, he wants to become the kind of man who would never have been blind to that betrayal in the first place. His efforts to steer his company toward more responsible practices, the very ones that might spare neighborhoods like Sier's, are part of that. But those efforts also put him in direct conflict with the old guard. There's a key meeting where his uncle pitches a high-profit, high-damage redevelopment that would, in practical terms, obliterate the street where Lincier's dessert shop stands. In his first life, he greenlit it without a second thought, seeing only the numbers. In this life, he sees the faces. He pushes back, suggesting a slower, more collaborative model that includes compensation, relocation support, maybe even resident co-ownership. Around the table, you can feel the temperature drop. This is not the playbook his family operates from. They mock him for letting sentiment cloud his judgment, remind him that he's not running a charity. One particularly cutting line from his father, "You think you're a savior now? The world doesn't need you to be good, it needs you to be effective." That line sticks with you, because it encapsulates the central conflict. Effectiveness in the old system often requires you to betray your own values. In the first life, he chose effectiveness. In this one, he's trying to choose differently, and the cost of that just keeps rising. On the romance side, things are no less complicated. The more Lincier lets him into her life, the more she realizes there's something off about him. Not in a creepy way, but in the way he sometimes reacts too strongly to things that should be minor, or stares at familiar places with the haunted eyes of a man visiting a graveyard. There's a moment where she takes him to a small neighborhood festival, proudly showing him the handmade lanterns, the old storytellers, the kids with sticky hands winning cheap prizes. He smiles, genuinely warmed by the scene, but when he sees a little boy trip and scrape his knee, bursting into tears, something in him snaps. The film cuts to a flash of another child, another fall, another time when he, as a young father in his first life, failed to show up in a crucial moment because he was too busy chasing a deal. That wound, linked to a family tragedy the movie slowly hints at, is still raw. He rushes over to the festival kid a little too fast, startling everyone, and kneels down with this fierce, fragmented tenderness that doesn't match a stranger's overreaction. He consoles the boy, fusses over him, until the boy's actual father arrives, confused. Lincier watches all this with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Later, she asks him, gently, "You act like someone who's lost a lot." He doesn't answer at first. How do you explain that you've lost an entire lifetime? But those are the moments where their intimacy grows, through questions she's brave enough to ask, and truths he's slowly willing to hint at, even if he can't lay them all out yet. He tells her little things, that he made a lot of selfish choices once, that he hurt people he loved because he was too proud to admit he was wrong, that he's now trying, however clumsily, to live in a way that might make up for something. She doesn't push him to name it. She just listens, sitting beside him on a park bench, letting silences stretch. Those silences are one of the film's secret weapons. It trusts you to feel the unspoken things, to read the small shifts in body language. It's not racing to fill every gap with dialogue. It's letting the characters breathe, which makes the moments when they do finally speak their deepest fears all the more searing. Eventually, the truth of their shared childhood surfaces, and when it does, the film wisely refuses to make it neat. It happens late one night in the nearly empty dessert shop. A violent storm has cut off the power, and they are sitting by candlelight, surrounded by shadows and the smell of sugar. The old owner, Auntie, joins them, and in the way older people do when they sense a story forming, she starts reminiscing about the days when Sia used to sneak extra cakes to that lonely boy behind the big wall. It's a harmless anecdote to her, something sweet and nostalgic. But to the two people sitting across from her, it lands like a revelation. Lincier turns slowly towards Su Linfeng, her eyes wide, searching his face for confirmation. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't joke it away. He just nods, very slightly, and says, "I never forgot those cakes." In that instant, you can almost hear the gears in her mind grinding into place. She remembers the feel of that wall's rough surface, the sound of a boy crying quietly because his father had scolded him again, the bitter argument the adults had when they found out, the way she shouted his name over and over into the empty space where he stopped answering. And then the years after, when the wall remained but the boy never came back, and eventually, the wall came down and a tower rose in its place. The betrayal doesn't hit her as a clean cut, it comes in waves. First there's wonder, this man, this complicated, strangely familiar man, is the boy she never quite stopped thinking about. Then there's anger, he remembered, but he never told her. He walked into her life with all this knowledge, all this emotional leverage, while she stumbled around in the dark, opening her heart to him one vulnerable piece at a time. In a gut punch of a scene, she stands up, knocking over her chair, and demands, "How long have you known?" He answers honestly, "Since that day at the wall. Since I went back." That word, back, confuses Auntie, but Lincier hears the subtext, "Since he chose not to tell me." She asks him the question we've been waiting for, "Why didn't you say anything?" His answer is messy, halting. He talks about shame, about how the boy she remembers was kinder than the man he became, about how he abandoned her first, about how he was afraid that if she linked him too clearly to that memory, she'd also link him to everything his family's company has done to people like her. He says he wanted, selfishly, to be seen as the person he is trying to be now, not the sum of both their pasts. Her eyes fill with tears, but not the romantic kind. These are tears of someone realizing that, once again, the power dynamic in her relationships is skewed, that the men in her life always seem to be holding cards behind their backs while she lays hers bare. She tells him, voice cracking, that every time she thought, "He understands me," he already had a map of her heart from years ago. Every time she believed they were building something new, he was quietly drawing lines between this life and a history she didn't consent to relive. She's not wrong. And the film doesn't let him weasel out of that. There's no magical, "but I did it for love," that fixes it. Instead, he stands there and takes it, letting her anger burn through him, not defending himself, not redirecting the blame. In that moment, his redemption isn't in a grand gesture, it's in his willingness to be seen as deeply flawed by the one person whose image of him matters most. Lincier walks out into the storm after that, leaving him in the flickering candlelight. It's not a permanent breakup, but it is a necessary fracture. They both need to re-evaluate what they mean to each other, now that the ghosts of the wall are fully out in the open. While their relationship hangs in that fragile in-between, the external plot tightens its grip. The ex-wife of his first life, now a formidable executive in a rival firm, sees an opportunity. She senses his shift, his refusal of certain deals, his push for ethical nonsense, as some in the board call it, and decides he's either weak or distractible. Her goal is simple, either bend him back into the man she can manipulate, or break him and take over the pieces. She starts circling him in public spaces, offering alliances that are, on paper, beneficial, but loaded with the same kind of subtle control she wielded last time. Their scenes together now are like watching two chess players who've already played this exact match once. She moves a piece, suggests a risky but lucrative investment, makes a veiled comment about how it's lonely at the top without someone at your side who understands pressure, and waits to see if he'll make the same losing move. But he doesn't. Not this time. One particularly striking scene has her invite him to a private dinner under the guise of discussing a potential partnership. The restaurant is one they frequented in the later years of his first marriage, and as he sits across from her now, the film superimposes flashes of that other timeline, her hand touching his with feigned affection, her practicing her look of concern in a mirror, her rehearsing lines about loyalty while negotiating his demise with his enemies. In this life, she plays the same notes, but his face doesn't soften. It hardens. Not into hatred, but into a calm, firm resolve. When she suggests they reconsider what might have been between us, there's a brief, loaded silence. In another story, he might have exploded, laid out everything she did in the first life, screamed accusations that would sound insane to everyone else in the room. Here, he just looks at her with this almost pitying sadness and says something like, "You and I, we were always running in opposite directions, even when it looked like we were side by side." She laughs it off, tries to flirt it away, but the tone has shifted. She doesn't own the space anymore. He does, because he knows how this game ends and refuses to play it again. But rejecting her comes at a cost. She retaliates not with theatrics, but with cold, strategic strikes, leaking half-truths about his instability, feeding rumors that he's making irrational decisions because of some woman, nudging investors to question whether his newfound ethics are just sentimentalism. At the same time, the media starts to circle around his connection to Lincier, thanks to a few well-timed photos, accidentally captured of them together. Overnight, she goes from anonymous dessert girl to mysterious commoner who's ensnared the heir. The online world does what it always does, projects, judges, invents narratives. People dig through her past, misinterpret her small financial struggles as signs of gold digging, and use her kindness as a weapon against her. The film handles this with a grim realism that will feel painfully familiar to anyone who's watched how public opinion can devour ordinary lives. When she discovers what's being said about her, Lincier's first instinct isn't noble acceptance, it's raw panic and fury. She storms into his office, eyes blazing, slams her phone onto his desk, and demands, "Is this what being with you means? That every mistake I've ever made, every debt I've ever struggled with, every stupid photo from my youth is now evidence in some twisted trial I never agreed to stand in?" Su Linfeng, who has grown up with cameras in his face, is deeply shaken. He knew exposure might come, but he underestimated how vicious it would be, and how personally she would feel it. For him, scandal is a professional hazard. For her, it's an existential threat. Her community, her family, the small shop built on trust, all of that can crumble fast under the weight of gossip and suspicion. The scene between them here is messy, loud, and uncomfortable, in the best way. She doesn't let him martyr himself by saying, "Blame me, it's all my fault." Instead, she forces him to see the structural disparity. "You get to decide to walk into the fire," she yells, "but I get dragged in whether I'm ready or not." That's such a crucial line because it reframes the story entirely. His second life has become, in some ways, his project, his mission to fix, to redeem, to choose differently. But other people, like Lincier, didn't sign up to be part of that narrative. They have their own arcs, their own lives, and if he's not careful, his attempts to rewrite fate can become yet another way of centering himself at the cost of others. He hears that. You can see it in the way he deflates, in how his shoulders slump not just from defeat, but from comprehension. He apologizes, not with dramatic promises, but with the quiet admission that he underestimated the price she would pay just by standing next to him. He tells her that if she decides this is too much, if she wants out, he'll respect it, and he'll do everything he can to take the heat off her, even if it means publicly distancing himself. But what he doesn't do, and this is important, is make the decision for her. He doesn't say, "We should break up, for your own good." He finally understands that protecting her can't mean erasing her agency. The movie then gives us distance, time apart, where both characters simmer in their choices. Lincier retreats, temporarily, into the world she knows, the shop, her mother, her small circle of friends. Some of them are supportive, some are skeptical. There's a biting scene where a longtime neighbor, looking at an article on her phone, asks her, "So, now you're that girl? That girl who gets chosen by rich men?" The implied judgment cuts deep. At the same time, Su Linfeng is fighting battles on multiple fronts, inside the company, where his more radical ideas about social responsibility are being positioned as evidence of his incompetence, and outside, where the ex-wife's camp is quietly poisoning the well of public opinion. What keeps the film grounded through all this is that it never lets these conflicts turn into pure melodrama. They're intense, yes, but they always loop back to questions of character. How do you stay decent under fire? How do you love someone without turning them into a casualty of your war? How much are you truly willing to lose in order to live differently? As we move into the final act, the story sets up a convergence. There's a crucial shareholders meeting looming, one that will determine whether Su Linfeng retains control of the company. There's a demolition date set for the block where Lincier's shop and childhood home stand. And there's that unresolved rift between them, two people who have loved each other across lifetimes, now standing on opposite sides of a line neither of them fully drew. The film builds tension not with car chases or explosions, but with ticking clocks and advance notices. We see the demolition flyers being taped on crumbling walls. We see the company lawyers preparing their arguments. We see Su Linfeng, in his office late at night, staring at models of development plans, knowing that every arrow and square on those maps represent someone's home, someone's memory. And we see Lincier, alone in the shop after closing, walking her fingers along the worn edges of the counter, touching the cracked tiles on the floor, absorbing with all her senses the place that shaped her. One of the most quietly devastating scenes happens when she sits with her mother at their small kitchen table, the eviction notice between them. Her mother, who has spent her entire life just surviving, says something like, "Places come and go, see ya. What matters is that we're together." It's a comforting sentiment, but Lincier's eyes fill with tears, not because she disagrees, but because she's tired of watching her family be uprooted over and over by forces they can't control. She's tired of being expected to accept loss as a default. The film lets that anger sit there, dignified. It's not ungratefulness, it's generational exhaustion. And in parallel, we get Su Linfeng's own conversation with his father, which essentially becomes their moral showdown. The older man argues that this is just how progress works, that if their company doesn't do it, someone else will, that the weak adapt or they disappear. Su Linfeng, with the raw clarity of someone who has already lived the consequences, counters that the point of power, if it has any point at all, is to bend systems toward something less cruel, that hiding behind inevitability is just cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. His father scoffs, calls him naive, asks if this is all about that girl from the slums. And here's where Su Linfeng says something that reveals just how far he's come. It's about me, actually. About who I'm willing to be remembered as. If I live twice and still choose the same kind of man you taught me to be, then what was the point of my second life? That line cuts through the generational haze like a blade. The father doesn't have a ready answer, because that question isn't really for him, it's for the audience, for anyone who's ever looked back on their past and wondered if they've truly changed or just gotten better at explaining their choices. When the day of the shareholders meeting finally arrives, it's staged with a kind of quiet dread. We've seen rooms like this before in dramas, projectors, charts, suits, tense faces, but here, every nod, every crossed arm, feels loaded with more than corporate greed. It's about whether Su Linfeng will compromise to keep his seat, or stand by his newfound principles and risk being pushed out. In a moment that could so easily have become grandstanding, the film has him speak plainly. No sweeping speeches, no melodramatic threats. He lays out a vision for a slower, more responsible redevelopment model. Knowing full well that the numbers won't dazzle like his rivals' projections. He acknowledges that profits will be smaller in the short term. He admits that part of his motivation is personal, that he's seen up close what happens when people like him prioritize growth over lives, and he doesn't want to be that person again. When a hostile shareholder challenges him, saying, "Are you asking us to indulge your conscience at the expense of our returns?" there's this heavy silence. Then he says, "No. I'm asking you to decide what your returns will be measured in when you look back. In more zeros, or in fewer ghosts." It's a line that could make lesser actors sound ridiculous, but delivered with the weariness and conviction of someone who's literally haunted by another lifetime, it lands. Not enough to sway everyone, of course. The vote is close, but in the end, he loses. The old guard, wooed by the ex-wife's ruthless pragmatism and tantalizing projections, sides against him. He's effectively out. The film doesn't play this as a shocking twist, we've seen it coming. What's quietly radical is how it presents his loss. There's no slow clap, no last-minute reversal. He gathers his papers, stands, and walks out with an expression that is less defeat and more release. For the first time, he's unloaded the responsibility of steering a machine built on values he no longer shares. It hurts, but it's also freeing. Outside the meeting, in the sterile hallway, he pauses, leaning back against the cool plaster, feeling the enormity of what he's just let go of. His phone buzzes. A message, not from his ex, not from a lawyer, but from someone at the community organizing group that's been fighting the demolition. A photo, Lincier, standing at the forefront of a small crowd, facing down construction vehicles that have arrived ahead of schedule. The caption is simple, "They are here." And in that single moment, the personal and the political, the romantic and the ethical, crash into each other. He has no company authority anymore. No official power. What he does have are his relationships, his knowledge, his willingness to stand beside rather than above. The final stretch of the film isn't about him swooping in as a savior to stop the demolition, because legally, by this point, it's too far gone. Permits signed, orders processed, everything locked in long before his boardroom rebellion. He can't just snap his fingers and save the street. That's another way the script refuses cheap catharsis. Instead, he shows up as one more body in the crowd, one more voice adding weight to their resistance. The protest scenes are small-scale, intimate, no giant cinematic riots, just neighbors clutching hand-painted signs, shopkeepers yelling through cheap megaphones, teenagers live-streaming on their phones. Lincier sees him there, not on a podium, not in front with a microphone, but near the middle, holding a sign someone else made, listening to the organizers, following their lead. For a long beat, she just watches him. Watches how he interacts, not as a hero, but as a participant. A cop shoves someone, he steps in, not with a punch, but with calm de-escalation, leveraging the kind of calm authority his upbringing drilled into him. When a reporter shoves a camera in her face, trying to bait her into saying something that can be clipped into scandal fodder, he gently moves between them, not to speak for her, but to give her space to choose whether she wants to engage. It's a subtle distinction, but it matters. Later, when the machines start up and the line of police moves in, the reality sets in, they are not going to win this one. Not today. The films of our youth might have trained us to expect a last-minute injunction, some heroic reveal of legal documents, a deus ex machina. But here, the excavators roll forward. Bricks fall. Dust clouds bloom. The dessert shop, the one we've come to know so well, takes its first wound. Lincier cries, of course she does, and so do many others. There is genuine grief. But within that grief, there's also something else, solidarity. They've fought together now. Their resistance is part of the story of this place, and that doesn't vanish when the building comes down. It lives on in the people who experienced it. Afterward, in the eerie quiet that follows destruction, she and Su Linfeng stand amid rubble and dust. The sun is setting behind them, painting everything in this bittersweet gold. She picks up a piece of cracked tile from the shop floor, runs her thumb over it, then turns to him. "You couldn't stop it," she says, not accusingly, just stating a fact. "No," he replies. "Not this time." There's a pause. "Maybe if I had fought earlier, in another life," from inside, he trails off. The implication is clear, his first life was wasted on self-preservation. He waited too long to care. She looks at him for a long moment, then says, "You're here now." It sounds simple, but it's a profound grace. She's not absolving him of everything. She's acknowledging that showing up, even when you can't fix things, still matters. Then she does something that reframes everything, she hands him the piece of tile. "Help me carry this," she says. "We'll build somewhere else." And that, right there, is the heart of the film's emotional arc. Not, "You saved me," not, "You fixed everything," but, "If you really want to walk with me, then shoulder part of the weight of what I've lost, and let's create something new, imperfect, smaller, maybe, but ours." In the epilogue, we see the seeds of that new life. Time has passed, not years, but enough. On the outskirts of the city, in a less glamorous district, a modest little cafe is opening its doors for the first time. The sign is handmade, a little crooked, but charming. Inside, the decor is a patchwork, A counter salvaged from the old shop, new tiles laid by volunteers, mismatched chairs donated by neighbors. It's not shiny, but it's alive. Lincier moves through the space with purpose, checking the ovens, wiping tables, greeting early customers by name. This is her territory, her creation. Su Linfeng is there too, but not as the patron saint of the place. He's in the back, wearing an apron, utterly out of his element as he tries not to burn a tray of pastries under Auntie's supervision. He's learning the trade, not because he intends to become a baker, necessarily, but because stepping into her world means being willing to look ridiculous, to be a novice again after a lifetime of being the one in charge. Occasionally, running up to the display case with the same wide-eyed hunger we saw in young Su Linfeng's face in that long-ago memory. One of them presses his nose to the glass, staring at, yes, the almond cakes. Lincier smiles and glances back at Su Linfeng, who catches her eye and chuckles softly. He comes over, kneels to the kids' level, and asks, "First time trying these?" They nod enthusiastically. He tells them, with a twinkle in his gaze, that they're luckier than they look, and that anyone who eats them has to make a promise to be kind to someone else that day. It's a tiny scene, easy to overlook, but it encapsulates the film's belief in small, generational ripples of goodness. In terms of audience reaction and cultural impact, a story like Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah lands differently depending on what you bring into it. For viewers who've been burned by relationships where power and love got tangled in ugly ways, the idea of someone facing the exact same temptations and choosing differently the second time can feel deeply validating. For people from communities that have watched their neighborhoods vanish under development plans imposed from above, the film's refusal to turn gentrification into just a backdrop, its insistence on making it part of the emotional spine, hits close to home. There's a catharsis in seeing those experiences not only acknowledged, but tied to a narrative of rebirth that isn't just personal, but social. Critics have noted that while the reincarnation hook is familiar in East Asian dramas, this film does something subtle and significant. It shifts the center of gravity from revenge to responsibility. Instead of saying, "If I came back, I'd crush everyone who hurt me," it asks, "If I came back, would I still be the person who let them hurt me, and others?" That's a tougher, more introspective question. It's less about exterior enemies and more about interior reckoning. Performance-wise, the leads carry that beautifully. The actor playing Su Linfeng walks a tightrope between weariness and hope. You can see the age in his eyes even when his face is young. You can feel the double exposure of his experiences in small gestures, like how he hesitates before reaching out to touch something, as if half expecting it to vanish. The actress playing Lincier refuses to let her become a saint. She laughs too loud sometimes, snaps when she's stressed, nurses petty grudges and then regrets them. When she's angry, she doesn't do it decorously, her nose reddens, her voice cracks. That humanity makes the central romance feel earned rather than ordained. Cinematically, the film leans into imagery of thresholds, doors half open, alleyways leading from brightness into shadow, the literal wall that once divided their childhood worlds. Light and reflection play huge roles. In scenes from his first life, colors skew cooler, frames more rigid, his home and office lit like fishbowls where he's always on display. In the second life, the palette warms gradually as he steps away from those spaces and into hers, cramped kitchens with sunbeams catching dust, the glow of streetlights on rainy nights outside the shop, the soft flicker of candles during the blackout. As their lives intertwine, the cinematography blends these aesthetics, creating visual shorthand for the merging of their perspectives. The music complements this without overwhelming it, favoring piano, light strings, and a few recurring motifs that subtly shift in arrangement as characters grow. Su Linfeng's theme, initially sparse and almost monotonous, gains warmth and complexity when it intertwines with Lincier's more melodic motif. In moments of conflict, those themes clash or fall into dissonance. In moments of understanding, they resolve. It's not flashy, but it's smart. If there's one way to describe the pacing, it's patient. The story takes its time getting from one major beat to the next, trusting that you're here not for shock twists, but for emotional layering. Some viewers might find that slow, others will find it immersive. The absence of a metaphysical explanation for the reincarnation might frustrate those hoping for law or rules. We never find out why Su Linfeng, specifically, was reborn, or whether others were too. The film doesn't show gods, karmic councils, or timelines. It simply presents his new life as a given and focuses entirely on what he does with it. That restraint may feel unsatisfying for some, but thematically, it keeps the emphasis where the movie wants it, not on the mechanics of the second chance, but on the ethics of it. In the end, what makes Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah linger isn't its big reincarnation hook, but its small, stubborn belief in the possibility of incremental, imperfect redemption. Su Lin Feng doesn't fix the world. He doesn't even manage to save all the places and people he cares for. He loses his company. He watches buildings fall. He relives old wounds. But he also, finally, stops lying, to himself, to the people he loves, to the child he once was who peered over a garden wall longing for connection. Lincier doesn't turn into some pampered princess rescued by a rich man. She loses her shop, faces public humiliation, confronts harsh truths about the man she loves and the system he was born into. But she also refuses to stand quietly in the background of his story. She demands honesty, asserts her boundaries, and insists that if they are going to build a life together, it will be on shared ground, not on foundations dug by his guilt alone. The title, Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah, no longer the wrong lady, ends up resonating on multiple levels. It's not just about her no longer being the wrong woman he overlooked in favor of a more glittering but toxic choice. It's about both of them stepping out of roles where they were perpetually wrong by someone else's definition. He no longer the dutiful son who followed a script that destroyed him, she no longer the powerless girl whose attachments were always seen as mistakes. They are, by the end, not perfectly healed, not universally forgiven, but finally, living in alignment with their own values rather than in reaction to past harms. As the credits roll, you're left with this quiet, insistent question hanging in the air: if you woke up tomorrow with every memory of your worst choices intact, every moment you wish you could redo, what would you actually do differently, not just in grand gestures, but in the tiny, daily acts that add up to a life? Would you forgive differently? Would you leave differently? Would you love differently? Tak Lagi Jadi Nona Yang Salah doesn't pretend to have the answer. It just puts you in the shoes of someone who got that impossible chance and shows you that the hardest part of living twice isn't changing the world, it's being brave enough to change yourself, even when no one else believes you can.